Okay, I think we should get started.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institution of Civil Engineers. My name is Robert Mayer. I'm the president of this institution. I'm just going to ask Hannah Vickers just to make a couple of points relating to the sort of domestic side of the arrangements. Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. So, to repeat what I said earlier, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you here and also to be able to have the Science and Technology Committee's Brexit Science and Innovation Summit being held here in number 1 Great George Street. This is I hope you know, the worldwide home of civil engineering. And incidentally, we are celebrating our 200th anniversary this year, which coincides rather nicely with the Year of Engineering as declared by the government. So I'm going to say a few things and then I'll hand over to Norman, who's chairing the event. The House of Lords Science and Technology Committee, of which I'm a member, has looked at the issue of EU membership and UK science after the referendum. And it's vital for this summit, I think, to follow on from the recommendations of our committee. We must all work together to identify what actions are needed to mitigate the risks, and collectively, we must exploit the opportunities for UK science, research and innovation after Brexit. The committee's report, which was published in December 2016, and debated subsequently in the Lords in March 2017, was significantly titled A Time for Boldness. So 1 year on, this still stands as our key message. An uncertain era is certainly a time for boldness, not timidity. We need bold steps to prepare the UK for life outside the opportunities and constraints of EU membership, and to seek an even more prominent place for this country in the global economy. So we stand at a pretty vital crossroads in the Brexit negotiations. I don't really need to say that. It's pretty obvious to us all. We need to pick our priorities very carefully to ensure stability and, above all, certainty for our future relationship with the EU. We have to enable UK and EU researchers, institutions and businesses to deliver research and innovation excellence with long-term planning. It is predicted that by 2030, the UK will be the highest growth market for construction in Europe, overtaking Germany to become the 6th largest construction market in the world. And this represents a great opportunity. Studies have shown that they've consistently shown that investment in infrastructure has a strong multiplier effect. So for every 1 billion spent on construction, output is estimated to generate almost 3 billion in total economic activities. So for 1 billion spent on construction, that's generating 3 billion in total economic activity. But the construction industry is almost unique in not having seen productivity gains in recent decades, even though the quality of completed construction projects has steadily improved. And the recently announced construction sector deal, as part of the government's industrial strategy, one of the 4 sector deals so far announced, does go quite some way to ensure that investment in infrastructure continues its multiplier effect on the economy. How do we increase our productivity? How do we help government and industry meet the targets as laid out in its 2025 strategy for construction? These are very ambitious targets. 33% lower costs, 50% carbon reduction, 50% increase in exports. All of this crucially depends on collaborative research and innovation. So just to finish up, what are the barriers post-Brexit? First, we must maximize funding opportunities for research and innovation. Currently, the construction industry is not sufficiently well structured to deliver innovation without government support due to fragmentation, uneven workflow, and low profit margins. Secondly, we must consider allowing access by EU firms to UK research consortia and funding. We must encourage that. Improvement will come from a knowledge transfer between industries to enhance advances in automation, digitalization, supply chain logistics, process automation, and smart infrastructure. Thirdly, we must ensure long-term access to EU funding for collaborative research. Evidence shows that the UK is a net beneficiary of EU research-related activities, with a net gain of 3.4 billion euros above our contributions in the period from 2007 to 2013. Fourthly, we must allow favourable access to universities and academic and research institutions from and by EU researchers. Now, speaking as a professor at Cambridge University, I'm acutely aware that perhaps the greatest risk of Brexit on research comes from threats to academia. Construction research benefits from the impressive capabilities of our universities, and a decline here would have significant consequences. In my own department of engineering at Cambridge, we have over 300 postdoc researchers, most of them employed on research grants. These are the engine house of research. And this community of young, dynamic scientists and engineers from all over the world really underpin the university's world-leading reputation. 1/3 of these people are non-UK EU nationals. And the picture is similar across the whole of Cambridge University and indeed for other leading UK science and technology universities. We must also ensure access continues for UK construction professionals to offer services in the EU countries. Our leading position in digitalization, smart infrastructure represents massive opportunities, not only to the UK construction industry and the delivery of projects, but also as a highly exportable area of expertise. In addition, we must design the UK's future immigration system to allow the ambitious and close partnership for research and innovation that the UK is seeking with the EU. So we need to ensure that talented engineers, researchers, innovators from the 27 EU countries have certainty, both in the near term and the long term, about the opportunities to work here in the UK, and likewise for UK researchers to work in other EU countries. We must also take into consideration the existing skills gap, and there is an estimated 130,000 new engineers and engineering technicians needed per year until 2022. Finally, and I will then hand over to Norman, we must enable the UK to engage with EU discussions on regulation of new technologies and changes to existing regulatory frameworks. The UK has been involved in the development of regulations as part of its membership of the EU, and it's been very prominent in that role. And in doing that, the UK has been able to ensure that regulations do not adversely affect the development and delivery of UK products and services. So in conclusion, the strength of UK science, engineering, research and innovation can be maintained and grown with the right mix of skilled people, investment, networks and collaboration, and regulation and trade. So thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Norman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Robert, if I may. Sure. It's enormously appreciated also that the institution is hosting the summit today. And the strapline for the institution's mission on your website is shaping the world. So I reckon we fall fairly well into that statement with this discussion today. And we could be talking about building bridges, maintaining bridges, and so forth, all sorts of metaphors that might be relevant to the building that we're in, whether it would extend quite as far as Boris's bridge across the channel, I'm not sure, but we may get there. We've had lots of input so far into this discussion. We had the government's future partnership paper, which was published last September. Chris Whitty, the government's deputy chief scientific advisor, did confirm to us in his evidence to the committee that the document was, and I quote, high on aspiration but a bit light on detail. And I suspect there's probably wide agreement on that in this room. There's also been the previous Science and Technology Committee's post-referendum report, which followed quite closely after the referendum in 2016. And then for the process that we've entered into now as a committee, we have this summit, and then we will go on to an evidence session with the Minister. We will also subsequently visit Brussels as part of our deliberations. But we've had 80 written submissions from across the science and innovation community. So a lot of interest and determination, I think, to get this right. So thank you to everybody who's made submissions. It's all published on our website, so anyone who wants to see it can do so. I should also mention a really important contribution that's published this morning, actually, from the Wellcome Trust. It's their work with the Royal Society. We've just been in a breakfast briefing on that, and it has clear conclusions and recommendations for government. The report suggests, for example, that there could be a need for a standalone research and innovation agreement covering funding, regulation, and critically, as Robert was saying, movement of researchers. In particular, the report calls for the UK to secure associated country status in the Framework Programme 9, the successor to Horizon 2020. The briefing that we've just had made the point, and I think this is really important, that we should not take our preeminence in science for granted. We have to fight to maintain it and never be complacent that it is here always to stay. And I think also something that I picked up very strongly in a session I had with the Russell Group's EU group is that there's a degree of urgency here. It's not just about the shape of the agreement we reach, whether we're part, for example, of the successor to Horizon 2020, but when we get to that point, when we achieve certainty on the future, seems to me to be of enormous importance. People are shaping research projects here and now, and they need to know whether we're going to be part of that programme into the future. You will also have seen the Times reporting this week that Sir Mark Walport, the new chair of UKRI, has called for scientists to escape freedom of movement restrictions after Brexit. Perhaps of all the most significant of issues for very many people in the science community. So the critical question we'll be considering today is what action is needed now from the government. So we're delighted to have the new Science Minister, Sam Gyimah, who will be arriving in a little while. He's only been in post 6 weeks, so a rapid learning curve. I know all about that, but it's brilliant that he's been willing to come to address us this morning. You'll be hearing from him. It's also great that we've got Chris Jones, the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Department for Exiting the EU. If anybody specifically wants to know more about what his job is, then he's confirmed to me he's very happy to describe that. It's not fair for him to get involved in the big policy debate. That's for the politicians, but he's certainly very happy to clarify his role if appropriate. So after the summit, as I say, we're going to have an oral session, and the Minister will appear before us in that. So all of the issues that have been raised today can be part of that discussion. There will then be a short report, which will hopefully inform phase 2 negotiations. And we'll be picking up the baton from all the previous work, including the Wellcome and Royal Society work, and carrying it into the political sphere, hopefully influencing government as much as possible. I'm really delighted that I've got 4 fantastic colleagues from the committee here with me today. There's Martin Whitfield, there's Bill Grant, there's Vicky Ford. Vicky, incidentally, was a key individual within the European Parliament, leading the UK and leading the process in shaping Horizon 2020. So she's here, and also Neil O'Brien, who will be chairing the first session. The panels that we will have, I think, consider the key issues: people, funding and collaboration, and regulation. You'll hear brief contributions from panel members, 3 minutes, and then when we have contributions from the floor, the guidance is about 1 minute. Let's try and ensure that everybody has the chance to contribute without major speeches taking place. We've got an amazing array of panellists who've been willing to come to contribute this morning, so thanks to all of them. It's important for you all to be aware that the summit is being broadcast live online, so everything you say is self-evidently on the record. This is not Chatham House. So please do start your contribution by giving your name if you're called to speak. Wait for the microphone to reach you. We'll be strict on timing so that we can get through everything, although I'm conscious we've already slipped behind, but we'll try and recover that. And if you're tweeting today, please use the hashtag Brexit Science Summit. So I think it's crucial that science and innovation figures prominently in the negotiating process as an early priority. And it seems to me that doing a deal on this, being clear about the future, could set the tone for all the other discussions and could be a very valuable contribution to creating the deep and special relationship that the Prime Minister has said that she wants. So thank you all very much for attending. I hope that it's a useful, practical, pragmatic contribution to the discussion at this crucial stage of the negotiation. And I'd like to now hand over to Neil to chair the first session. Thanks very much indeed.
Panellists for the first session would like to come up to the front. I'm Neil O'Brien. I'm the MP for Harborough and a member of the Science and Technology Committee. And this first session is going to look at the crucial issue of people in the question of Brexit and science. I'd like to start by thanking our fantastic clerks and our panellists today for comprising a really, really high-powered panel. We are lucky to have with us Niall Dickerson, who is the chair of the Brexit Health Alliance and also the chief executive of the NHS Confederation. We have Naomi Weir, who is the deputy director of the excellent Campaign for Science and Engineering. We're honoured to have Savenki Ramakrishnan, who is not just the president of the Royal Society, but also a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and Professor Julia Buckingham, not just the treasurer of Universities UK, but also the vice chancellor of Brunel University. So let me just start by setting the scene for a moment. The government's green paper on science collaboration said that we would continue to welcome the best and brightest from around the world, that we would remain a hub for international talent, that we would have a system for continued mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and shortly after that they also announced that there would be 1,000 more Tier 1 visas in November 2017. I'm going to ask the panellists to set the scene for us very quickly with 3 minutes of their thoughts on this question, just to perhaps fuel the discussion. I think there are a number of questions. Do the panellists think that the measures that have been announced so far will allay some of the very real concerns in the science community? What are we in fact seeing on the ground? Are we seeing changes in the numbers of people applying for jobs in scientific research positions? What would the right future relationship for migration and cooperation look like in the context where we will have some kind of wider controls on free movement? And what do we need to nail down when? What do we need to sort in the coming months? What do we need to have figured out by the time we get to Brexit? And then, in fact, what do we need to do over the longer term? Thinking about things like the Rutherford Fund, how do we continue post-Brexit to be a place where we can attract the brightest and best and continue to collaborate at the highest level? So I'm going to ask the panellists to speak briefly in the same order that I introduced them. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Niall. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me. Just briefly say the Brexit Health Alliance brings together the National Health Service, the pharmaceutical and medical devices industries, the medical research community, professionals, patient groups and voluntary organisations. We don't have a view on the merit of Brexit, but we do have a commitment to try and make sure that the negotiations produce a result which is of benefit to UK patients and to the UK healthcare industry. And we also believe that such a deal would also benefit patients across Europe. So we have a range of concerns running from reciprocal rights through regulation, research, supply chain access to medicines and public health. But you've asked me to speak about the people issue. And I should say there's a parallel coalition which is chaired by my deputy, Danny Mortar of NHS Employers, called the Cavendish Coalition, which is looking particularly at the issue of healthcare and social care workforce and the implications of that, of the EU, UK leaving the EU. So I think the broad thing, which actually is a broad principle which underlines, I think, everything in every conversation that any of us have on this subject within the healthcare and the life sciences industry, that is that almost everything we do and the organising principle of this industry and sector is about collaboration and cooperation. There are, of course, aspects of competition which also apply, but that underlying process, whether you look at research or the way we build regulation or anything else, and this absolutely applies, of course, to the people area as well. We talk a lot about being preeminent in various industries, and of course life sciences is one that we absolutely want to protect, as has already been referred to in relation to civil engineering. But life sciences is an absolutely critical industry, and as Norman said, we should not take that for granted. Equally, I have to say, and I was in Brussels yesterday, I think there is a danger sometimes that we talk too much about our own preeminence and that actually we assume that all the Europeans will say how wonderful and fantastic we are. We've got to be very careful about how we play this process. The answer is that Europe will survive very well without us. So we need to remember that, but we also need to show what value that we can give and do in that process, and how continued cooperation and collaboration. At the heart, frankly, of our success, and it was well illustrated, I think, by Robert's comments at the beginning, is how dependent we are on Europeans coming here. So our success as a life science industry is not simply based on us growing our own and doing something on our own. And indeed, research has become so interdependent now, much more, I suspect, than it was even one generation ago, both in terms of the development of ideas, but also in terms of how you test out those ideas and the need for larger groups and larger clinical trials and more reliance on each other. So the importance, therefore, of us being able to exchange individuals and for us to be an attractive place for people to come. Now, in some senses, I actually think this may be an easier thing to overcome on the people side than some of the other areas, because actually if we're saying we are going to control our own immigration, then in a sense, we can try and make ourselves as an attractive a place as possible for people to come. You mentioned, Neil, the point about the impact of what had happened so far. I don't think there's any doubt that the uncertainty which surrounds almost all the areas I've touched on, and certainly this people area, has been detrimental thus far. And you can see it a bit in the numbers, but it's more important that what's going on in people's heads. There is definitely a sense, and an NHS trust recently looked at its EEA staff and asked them how they felt. And there was no doubt more of them were thinking about going home. Well, okay, some of that may indeed be to do with the fall in the pound and the value of the amount that they earn. But there was also a feeling that they were less welcome. And remember, for the most talented of people, that they don't need to come here. This is about us attracting them. It's about us being an attractive place. So I think the heart of this is we need to develop an immigration framework which is flexible, which is absolutely attractive to the talent that we want to bring into this country. And as a nation, we need to be somewhere which is both attractive, but also attractive in terms of retaining people going forwards. We absolutely welcome the recognition in phase one of the rights of people who are already here, and that's progress. I mean, it's progress, but it is limited, of course, because it's limited to that group, and secondly, it's not agreed until everything is agreed. So we welcome that as a first and small step, but we need to move forward much more rapidly. And what we are looking for, in very simple terms, is for the government, and the right signals in principle have been made, but we need to get concrete proposals about how we will continue to attract and retain the talent we need. Otherwise, that preeminence that Norman mentioned will not be retained.
Thank you very much, Niall. That is a lot to think about there. Naomi.
Thank you. Leaving the European Union provides a reset point for UK immigration policy. There is an opportunity to develop a UK immigration system that contributes to the UK being a global hub for science and engineering, and of course reaping the economic and societal benefits that would bring. To date, as we all know, the UK has benefited from free movement of scientists and engineers across the European Union and recruitment from beyond the EU. Although, as we've seen in recent months, that hasn't always run so smoothly. So now the government must take the opportunity to create a new system that allows science and engineering to thrive. And Case calls on the government to do that in two ways. One is rebuilding confidence in the short term, and then creating a streamlined system in the long term. So to rebuild confidence in the short term, we've already heard of the uncertainty that surrounds Brexit. The government should amend visa rules, improve immigration messaging, and provide confidence during the Brexit transition. Take, for instance, the Tier 2 cap that's been in the headlines recently. Businesses need a predictable immigration system. The Tier 2 cap increases uncertainty. And this winter, due to the cap being reached, hundreds of business-critical roles are going unfilled, damaging productivity. In the short term, roles on the shortage occupation list should be exempt from the cap, and no such arbitrary cap on skilled workers should be implemented in a new system. Or take, for instance, indefinite leave to remain rules. Some UK-based research requires long periods overseas for data collection or for using international infrastructure. Rules currently preventing researchers wishing to obtain indefinite leave to remain from spending more than 180 days in any 12-month period in the course of their work fails to recognise the nature of work in our sector. So despite having the expertise to contribute to UK science and wanting to build a career here, the current rules mean some researchers have been denied the right to settle. This could easily be resolved by amending indefinite leave to remain rules to permit research activity overseas as part of their rules. Now, these policies aren't just policies in themselves about non-EU workers. These policies drown out statements about welcoming the brightest and best post-Brexit. And they contribute to the damaging message that the UK is not open to scientists and engineers from across the world. Unfortunately, all the while, the UK public support immigration of skilled workers, and scientists and engineers in particular. Immigration messaging from government must improve, instead promoting the UK as a place to learn, earn and contribute. And government must work across departments to promote the UK as a global research and innovation hub. As we've heard, we can't take that for granted. And that must be through trade missions, through international strategy, Brexit negotiating positions, and ministerial speeches. Our members are clear that immigration rules should only change once following a Brexit transition period. Early confirmation from the UK government that they will maintain current migration rules and rights throughout transition and until a new system can be effectively delivered would provide much needed certainty and confidence for employers and individuals. Now, looking to the long term, the government must create a streamlined system. As we heard, the current system is not fit for purpose for our sector. Such a system must facilitate frictionless movement, have proportionate system rules, and be founded on robust evidence. For instance, to support frictionless movement globally, there should be visa-less options for visits, training, and work. These could also form part of trade deals and research agreements, but there must be options. One of the major issues in recent years is a lack of robust data supporting immigration decisions. And so we support Home Affairs Committee recommendations recently for annual reporting of migration flows and the economic contribution of migration to inform policy and to inform public debate. On the Chair's questions at the beginning, and to echo Norman Lamb's comments earlier, on timings, this is urgent. Messaging and domestic policies must be and can be unilaterally changed. And these must happen soon, because the messages are being watched by an international audience, and we can't afford to continue in the way we have been so far. And on the effects so far, this is something we're actively seeking input on from our members, and we'll, of course, get back to the committee once we have more. But many have already flagged concerning, but perhaps understandable, hesitance from EU nationals in taking up posts. But also, some have seen drops in applications for posts and fellowships and postdocs, for instance, so far. So this is urgent and must be addressed.
Naomi, thank you. That was commendably specific, I thought, as well. I should also, at this point, apologise for introducing Neil as a Niall. So on behalf of all Neils, I apologise unreservedly to you.
Sorry, I can't spell it. It's the problem.
It's the narcissism of small differences or something. With that in mind, I will now hand over to Savenki. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot has already been said. So there's no point in my repeating the same thing. And I should say the Wellcome Trust document that came out of a joint meeting that the Wellcome Trust and the Royal Society held with many of our EU colleagues a couple of weeks ago has some very specific recommendations that I think are really right on target. So I want to talk a bit more generally about mobility. In my view, mobility is probably the single most important thing in science, more than all of the other factors. I agree you need all of the other things, but you can't do science without being able to recruit talent. Now, I came here to work at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, which just celebrated its 15th Nobel Prize winner last October. And this is a lab that was founded by Max Perutz, who was an immigrant. The first 3 directors of the lab were all immigrants. They all won Nobel Prizes. In fact, the most recent Nobel laureate, Richard Henderson, actually is a sort of immigrant too. He comes from Scotland. Sorry, Graham. So anyway, the most recent appointment for the director, who's going to take over in April, is Jan Louvet, an immigrant from Germany, who, by the way, on June 24th, 2016, received 4 phone calls from Germany including the head of the German Research Foundation, saying he could come back to Germany on any terms, okay? And he decided to stay here. Now, why do people come to Britain? I think that one of the reasons is they perceive Britain as a very open and meritocratic society, okay? And it's second only to the US in terms of its openness to talent from abroad. And that really is what made British science excellent, or actually has sustained its excellence. Now, you may ask, why is mobility important at all? Why couldn't we simply grow our own talent? And why do we need immigrants? Well, the reason is that when you have mobility, you have a much more rapid exchange of ideas and expertise. And that allows you to sort of remain at the cutting edge of essentially any science or technology. You cannot in isolation hope to sort of be the leader forever. You may be the leader temporarily, but then other people will have different ideas. If you don't know them, then and you're not in good communication, you don't have shared expertise, you have a problem. And so that's the reason why we must encourage mobility. And so I want to reiterate some of the other things that were said. We need to have a system in place that makes mobility easy. We have to understand that scientists have short-term visits, sometimes they have long-term field visits. We need to have a visa system that takes into account what the nature of scientific work is. So temporary absences are not counted against you, even long-term absences sometimes. If you're an archaeologist or an anthropologist, they're not counted against you. Scientists do have families, and also they have to make decisions. Often the best scientists will have lots of job offers, and if they have to go through a huge bureaucratic process, they're going to say, well, actually, I'd rather go somewhere else. Why should I go through all this hassle? And so these are the things to keep in mind when we sort of move ahead. And the recommendations should sort of follow what the scientific enterprise is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Vicky. That is incredibly powerful and an amazing story about your colleague, which is something we should all keep in our minds. So before we move to questions and answers, and I'm going to ask Professor Julia Buckingham to speak.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak on behalf of Universities UK. And for those of you who don't know anything about UUK, we represent 134 universities right across the UK, including Northern Ireland. I don't want to reiterate many things which have been said already, but of course the university sector does have an incredibly important part in driving science and innovation, not working in isolation, but working with businesses, industries right across the world, not just in the UK. And that's going to be critically important, not just in delivering the industrial and life sciences strategy, which we all know are unbelievably important, but also in making sure that we continue to build fundamental knowledge to ensure a pipeline for our successors to translate into economic value in due course. And both of those are incredibly important. And I just don't think we can overemphasize the importance of our sector attracting and retaining talent from across the world. Since 2004, the proportion of non-UK university staff in research roles has gone up from 34% to 47%. Looking at publications, in 1981, just 10% of UK publications were in collaboration with someone from outside of the UK. In 2017, well over 50% of publications were in collaboration with people from outside the UK. Science is international, and we have to work in an international context. And of course, the EU's played an absolutely amazing part in enabling us to have that type of collaborative activity. We've heard how unbelievably important mobility is, but also the EU's enabled networks to be set up. And we all work by networks, and networks are relationships. They take a long, long time to build, they involve trust, and they can be destroyed very easily. And I think we are at high risk at the moment of destroying quite a lot of those relationships. Those networks are the ways in which Professor X says to his young scientist, wouldn't it be great if you went and did a postdoc with Professor Y in the UK. That's how this mobility actually happens. Those networks are not just chat shops, they are things which really, really drive science. But looking at the way in which we work in the UK, if I take my own university as an example, we simply couldn't function without our highly committed EU and overseas staff. 25% of my staff come from outside of the UK, and 2/3 of those people work as researchers in engineering, design, and technology. Just as Cervenki said, and himself did, many people come from outside the UK and make their careers here. To give you an example from my own university, one runs a majors metals research centre. In the past 3 years, he's attracted well over £100 million in funding from the government, research councils, the automotive industry, and its supply chains. His team's doing absolutely groundbreaking work in sustainable manufacture, and he has major partnerships right across Europe, China, and other parts of the world. He's not running a cottage industry, it's a truly global endeavour. And there are many, many other examples right across academia. Every vice-chancellor could name several people in their university, many people in some universities, who are doing that type of work. Of course, we welcome the commitments made in phase 1 of the Brexit negotiation that our EU nationals can stay here. And that has, I think, helped to allay some fears. But those fears have not gone away. And we really, really do need to see now a true commitment to those people. And we would like the government to say right now, these people and their families are going to be able to stay here, and that their young people are going to be treated, their children are going to be treated as UK people when it comes to education in the UK. That's incredibly important. I know funding is going to be talked about by another committee, but I do think it's important that this situation of nothing agreed until everything agreed is going to have consequences for universities unless we have agreements fairly soon. We really do need to have confidence that we are going to be able to retain mobility of researchers, maintain those networks, and maintain our international partnerships and funding. I am going to say something about international students because I think it's very, very important. We understand the incredibly important role they have in helping us deliver cutting-edge research. About 6% of students in the UK come from other UK countries, and 14 come from the rest of the world. But when you start looking at the STEM subjects and you start looking at postgraduate subjects, it is incredibly concentrated in those areas. In any research laboratory, the PhD students make a huge contribution to the research effort. They're not doing projects in isolation from the rest of the team. They make a really, really fundamental contribution to that research. And without them, the productivity of our research labs would fall very, very significantly. Again, looking at my own university as an example, we are very international. In engineering, design, and technology, and that's what we're known for, 60% of my research students come from outside of the EU. 30% come from the EU, just 10% come from the UK. If we lose those UK students, of course our research will suffer enormously. But research won't be the only casualty. We will also see closure of master's courses, which will no longer be financially viable. These are master's courses in areas like advanced manufacturing, product design, which currently provide the pipeline for the talent that our industries need to drive forward their productivity. We are optimistic of what's going on with the Migration Advisory Committee, but much of the debate has focused around overseas students and the net migration target. The government could do much, much more than simply removing students from the net migration target. That would be very nice. But we would also like to see simplification of the compliance that universities are required to adhere to with overseas students, and a really strong, well-coordinated, cross-departmental government strategy to communicate a really positive, welcoming message to international students, EU students. We want this talent to come to the UK. And as I said, these students are key to our ability going forward as a nation to deliver high-quality science and innovation. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Professor Buckingham. So some very important statistics there, important emphasis on the importance of students, and also on the importance of positive messages. Now, I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions and answers. I think we've got until just after 10, so the clerks can make a yelling a little bit more than that. Perhaps we will go into extended time. So if I can ask... So if I can ask people to put up their hands, the roving mic will seek you out, and if you can say who you're from, and if you can keep questions reasonably short and to the point, as the speaker always says. Let's start with the lady in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Sue Ferns. I work for Prospect Trade Union. We represent about 50,000 STEM professionals across the economy. There's nothing I would disagree with in what the panellists have said, but just to add a bit of flavour to this, this is the issue. The issue of people is the one that concerns our members most. We surveyed them shortly after the referendum, and at that time about 1 in 5 EU nationals said they were considering leaving the UK. We repeated that in November last year, and that by then it had gone up to 70%, which I think emphasises the importance of how people are feeling. So absolutely we need these messages about attracting and welcoming people, but I think we need to be careful about language. So brightest and best. Science is international, but it's also a team endeavour, so we need to think about early career scientists, we need to think about technologists who come as part of those scientific teams. So to come to my question, in terms of the future immigration regime, we don't think either the shortage occupation list or an extension of the current international Tier 2 salary threshold is adequate. We would like to see the government place trust in science employers to know what talent they need. My question is, would the Science and Technology Committee, would the panellists agree with that?
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions together just so that we can have then answers from all the panel. We'll go to the lady in the very back row. By the way, that's a great question.
Not so much a question as a comment, sorry, my name is Felicity Birch. I'm the Head of Innovation and Digital Policy at the CBI. I just wanted to sort of raise the business perspective around mobility on science and innovation. From a business perspective, you know, ultimately the reason for innovating is to grow their business or to improve profitability. And the only way you can do this is if you can sell your new products or your new services once you've developed them. And as much as science and innovation is a contact sport, so is sort of growing your market. And for many businesses, the ability to work collaboratively with their customers is a hugely important part of that. So I really wanted to just sort of back up what Naomi was saying around the ability for people to be able to move around to train people, to spend time with other businesses, and to do extended visits. It's not just important from development of new ideas, but actually for selling those ideas as well.
Very good. I'm going to take one third question before we start, and there's a gentleman in the second row who is very quick to get his hand up. He's in the extremely far away from the microphone, but our chief clerk will race round to you.
Thanks. My name is David Cole-Hamilton. I represent the Royal Society of Edinburgh and therefore could be considered an immigrant under Brexit. However, actually, I'm an Englishman, so I'm an emigrant, not an immigrant. I was at a meeting yesterday with the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee, and I want to refer to the comments that Julie Buckingham made. He said there is no cap on foreign students coming to the UK, and there will be no cap on foreign students coming to the UK. There are a number of foreign students there who are very nervous that there will be a cap. So if there's not going to be a cap, surely the government should say so, and that would clarify the situation completely.
Okay, so I've got 3 questions there. One was quite specific about Tier 2 visas, shortage occupations versus some kind of system based on trust in science employers, however defined. There's a question about the importance of training, taking us a bit beyond potentially a narrow definition of the science community, and then a question about students. I'm going to put Naomi on the spot by asking her to go first, because she mentioned this already.
Thank you. So specifically thinking about the question that Sue raised around what could that system actually look like that might work for science, and as I said in my comments, extending the Tier 2 system, we've heard loud and clear from our members, is not going to be a viable option, particularly for the point Sue raised around those who currently wouldn't meet the Tier 2 requirements but who are vital for science, which is a team sport. And a couple of options that we've been trying to work up. One of them could be around using things like a resident labour market test, which already exists, and plus a job offer from a trusted employer. So that might be an employer who has a relationship with the Home Office around sort of for some other forms of migration. Could be one option.
Can you just explain a bit about how that works exactly, just for people who are less close to this?
At the moment, institutions such as Brunel would be a trusted sponsor on the Home Office register for Tier 2 and Tier 4 student and skilled workers, for instance. So they have a relationship with the Home Office and known to them. So it could be that there's ways that might meet Home Office requirements around rigour, plus a labour market test that might satisfy. And there's also something from the Life Science Industrial Strategy. We've heard from the government this sort of openness about looking at the idea of bringing in teams was mentioned in there in terms of migration. So not just the lead scientist, but actually perhaps there's a recognition a bit of that team language in that strategy. And so there's certainly option there for us to look at what that might look like for bringing in teams. There might be a technician who's a scientist has worked within their team internationally, and they are particularly good at whatever cell culture they're doing or whatever it might be. So there's options in there in the language already. The other thing, which is a bit further forward-looking, and I'm not suggesting, along with many things, that this could be done by 2019 or indeed 2021. However, there is something around making sure that the UK is fit for the future. So there's the opportunity, and this is where science and technology obviously plays a role as well, improving processes and increasing policy options by developing world-leading passport, visa and security technologies might mean we can move beyond a binary visa, no visa system. This isn't necessarily something for the next 2 years, but certainly if we're looking to make sure that the UK is fit for the future on migration, that's got to be somewhere where science and technology plays a role in making sure we can find ways of satisfying security needs while also ensuring we can access talent without the burden that we've talked about existing in the current system.
Very good. I won't ask all panel members to comment on all questions, but does anyone else particularly want to jump in on this in response? Doesn't.
Well, just to say,
I'll hand over to Neil.
Thank you very much, and a Scott as well. I think we need to approach this on the basis of a completely different set of principles. We've always gone on the principle of immigration, of how do we keep people out of this country, and we need to turn that, in a sense, on its head here. Trying to develop a system which is based on access on one or other characteristic only, the skill level or the pay or the region that these people come from. We've got to develop a much more flexible system which is based on the needs of this country. And the needs of this country in terms of science and technology have not been sufficiently recognised. There are other sectors as well. There are issues about healthcare professionals and so forth which similarly need attention. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing more to grow our own talent. I think that there's a separate argument alongside that, which is not a bad one, it's a good one. But we will always be dependent on people from other countries, and we need to just develop a much more flexible system. We've talked a bit about people going abroad for periods of time. Ridiculous rules that just make life difficult for people. Instead of saying we're trying to encourage that talent, we recognise that people may need to be abroad for a period of time and then to come back. And again, likewise, how we treat their families and their children will be absolutely critical. So start with an immigration framework which recognises we need these people, we want to attract these people, therefore what do we need to do to enable ourselves, in terms of national security and everything else, we have to do the right things by that, but how do we have a set of principles? And I still feel that our approach is based on how do we keep people out or keep a number down.
Professor Bunky, you want to jump in?
Sure. One thing to keep in mind is that regardless of how much talent we grow here, we will always need talent from abroad, because if you want to be the best in the world, you have to recruit from the best. I mean, sports teams know this.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
And, it's the same with science. The other thing is, I do agree that employers should have quite a bit of discretion in terms of being able to hire. So my own preference would be to have, you know, a long list of trusted employers, and if you are on that list and you offer a job to somebody, that is actually prima facie the requirement in order to get a visa. And you could argue, you know, who goes on the list and so on, and how do you get on the list, or how do you get taken off the list? But those are things that could be potentially worked out. And so that might be a way to sort of streamline this procedure rather than having to submit a huge mass of paperwork to the Home Office.
I could see you were stimulated by that thought. You wanted to... Sorry, just before we come to...
I was just... certainly that's one option that will work for a section of employers and a section of recruitment and mobility. But smaller employers who at the moment don't interact with a tiered system because it's too burdensome, there needs to be options for them. There's whole areas of science and technology where there are consultants or those who are much more sole traders, or maybe don't have a job but have a contract, and so we don't have an option at the moment for how that works. So there's new things that need to be included.
So you might potentially even want to have both. Professor Buckingham.
Well, I agree with what's been said, but I think we also need to recognise that if you are a trusted sponsor, actually some simplification of the system would also be extremely welcome, because otherwise we're in danger of setting up an amazingly complex bureaucratic system for quite small employers, which I'm not sure would be welcome. So I would certainly think we should be asking for simplicity in what we're doing to make it transparent but easy to do. But I'd like to go back to the point about taking, there is no cap on student numbers. We are always told that. But in the next breath, we're told about the restriction on immigration numbers. So I think there is a certain lack of clarity, and I think all of us would like some clarity as to whether we really are open for business, which I hope very much we are, and what exactly that means. And also, going back to the point about making the UK attractive to people from overseas to come here, one point I didn't mention was for students, post-study work visas are unbelievably attractive. And at the time that we reduced that opportunity for international students, the Australians took that opportunity up, and you only have to look at the statistics to realise the impact that that had. And of course, those people are very, very talented people who really want to use the skills and expertise that we have taught them in the UK, and it seems a great shame to me to lose that talent, because while we do need to grow our own talent, I absolutely agree with that, it will not happen overnight. We need to be realistic that it's a long haul to grow talent.
Very good. So we have time for a few more questions before we break. We're going to go to the gentleman in the second row here first, then we'll take another batch from over here. Maybe there's three more over there.
Good morning. I'm Michael Arthur. I'm President and Provost of UCL, and I chair the EU Advisory Group for the Russell Group of Universities. My point is really one about urgency and people. And to illustrate that, I'll give you a little bit of data from UCL. So we advertise a series of excellence fellowships, mainly in biomedical sciences. Each year, we usually have over 100 applicants. On average, we would expect 30% or so of those applicants to be from other European institutions. This year, we dropped from 30% to 0 applications. Something that really quite shocked me. So real evidence that the impact is already upon us. So given that, I asked my HR department to look at all academic jobs that have been advertised in 15-16 and to compare that with 16-17. Usually we would receive, on average, 25% of applications for an academic job would come from Europe, European citizens, non-UK. That's dropped by 5%. And when I look at it faculty by faculty, it's almost identical across every single faculty in the institution. Okay. So it's not just science, it's impacting right across the whole spectrum. Medicine, life sciences, law, social sciences, arts and humanities, and so on. So I suppose if I turn this into a question, would you agree with me that it's really urgent for the government to say something very concrete about future careers for European scientists in this country, And if I can just get one irritation out of my system, I cannot stand the phrase, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, because it seems to me that that's just some sort of diplomatic ruse. We need to break through that, and we need to be pushing for decisions that stick in this area rather urgently. Thank you.
Very good. I'm not a statistician, but those seem like statistically significant numbers you're talking about. There's a lady in the third row there, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the middle, and then there's two other people just over there.
Hi, my name is Estrella Luna Diez, and I am the president of the Society of Spanish Researchers in the United Kingdom. I represent a society of 700 members out of the 5,000 researchers, Spanish researchers living in this country. So we are very concerned about the developments and the agreements of Brexit, but we wanted to know as well the impact of Brexit in our members. So we've run two surveys now, 2 years, and also one survey in Spain. And the clear result out of these surveys are that there is a stark decline in the attractiveness of the UK to Spanish people.
So to come to a question?
Yeah, so basically, just to give you very quick numbers, only 14% of our members that currently live in the UK would come to the UK now under current circumstances, and also 70% of Spanish researchers living in Spain consider the UK less attractive. Okay, and we think that one of the reasons is because there is a not effective communication strategy. So my question is, what is going to be done not only inside but also outside the UK to show that the UK is open for business?
Good question, and important bits of data. We're going to go to the gentleman who's in the middle and then on.
Thank you, Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. Just to reiterate the urgency point, a lot of the time the rhetoric from some of the politicians is around this is a problem that we will deal with, and when the final solution is arrived at post-Brexit, it will all be fine. But the reality is the uncertainty is causing problems right now, today, and our members tell us that people are not taking up job offers now. But I wanted to ask about Northern Ireland in particular. We've got quite a few members in Northern Ireland, and they are, in lots of cases, receiving very generous offers from Irish institutions, inviting them to come across the border. When we interact with them, there is a sense from our members in Northern Ireland that they feel that the scientific community in Northern Ireland is sometimes forgotten about when discussions are held by the broader scientific community in the UK. So my question would be, how do we reassure them that that particular situation that they've got will be considered front and centre in the types of debates that we have in discussions like this?
Good specific question. If you hand on to the gentleman just there.
I'm Johan Schot. I'm a Dutch citizen. I came to the UK for the type of research, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research that's done in the UK. My concern is this, and that's bringing another point to the debate. Brexit has certain causes that have to do with inequality, for example. Perhaps we can capture them by looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think the UK should become an exemplar for how to face these societal challenges, not just economic and productivity, but other challenges that will also attract excellent scientists and also allow a collaboration between the social sciences and the sciences, which is badly needed.
There you go. And was there another one there? Or is one final little question from my colleague on the committee?
Martin Whitfield, the MP for East Lothian. I'm going to ask the MP's question, which is there's been big discussion about urgency, and there has been a very succinct description of the danger of reality and misunderstood reality with the language and the messages. So to clarify, when you're talking about urgency, are you talking weeks, months? And what would be the final stop date after which the urgency becomes a true nightmare because it can't be put right?
Very, very good specific question. One absolutely last, very, very quick question.
So it is to address the urgency, and that is, people are asking us now if we apply for funding from the rest of Framework 8 or wish to come to Framework 9, are the government going to absolutely commit to the money? And they need to decide now.
Okay, that's actually going to probably get picked up in a later session. So we're looking for tweet-length answers from the panel on this question, because I know we have a Life Sciences Minister, a former Life Sciences Minister in the front row. There were questions about how soon is now, what are the thresholds, and a specific question about Northern Ireland as well. We'll go from left to right, I think, this time.
Well, I would respond firstly to Michael Arthur's comments. I think we are seeing a huge drop-off in applications from EU people, and so it is really urgent. So we have to do something very, very quickly, because our research base will begin to reduce, and those networks and relationships will fail.
Naomi, is there a particular deadline you'd point to?
I suppose the point about all agreed, nothing agreed, etc., there is some action that the UK can take unilaterally, and it must take that action as soon as possible. Some of those points around rule changes, and I think that points again, currently there is nothing preventing EU nationals from coming here in visa terms. It's all to do with potential future opportunities as well as whether or not they're welcome. And so that shows us that whatever system we put in place can't just be a system that allows people to come here, because currently EU nationals are allowed to come here. They just don't feel welcome and don't necessarily see it's a place for them to build their future. So that must be taken in mind as we put future rules in place.
Very important point. Neil.
So, urgency, yes. I think there is a need for government to provide greater leadership on the subject. I don't think you should underestimate, even where they can't make commitments, and I think they could probably make more commitments than they've made already, about mood music and absolutely being clear about what the direction of travel that we want to go in. And so we need more specifics, but we also need a greater sense that they recognise that what is happening now can't go on, and that they need to provide that clarity about the direction of travel in which we want to go.
And the last word goes to Venki.
Yeah, I think the importance of messaging is really, primary. They cannot have one message for some, extreme wing of their constituents and another message for the rest of the world, because everybody listens to everything. And, I'm actually, frankly, quite shocked to hear about the UCL results and also from the Spanish students here and researchers here. So I think it is urgent, and I think the government really needs to constantly reiterate what its intentions are, and to make sure that people realize that they'll continue to be welcome in Britain.
So, thank you, Neil, Naomi, and Julia. Thank you so much for your brilliant comments. Good questions as well. And before I hand back to Norman Lamb, just really remains for us to thank you in the traditional way. It's really good. That was some really good specific stuff there. I was worried we would get too much kind of not.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're going to have to box and cox a little bit. There's a certain inevitability that the minister is always late, and that's confirmed this morning. And so in a moment I'm going to introduce a special guest star that wasn't on the agenda but is brought to you today with a great sense of excitement. But first I was just struck very much by Neil's point about the need to change our mindset, that move away from keeping people out and think instead about how we attract great people to this country. And Venki made the point about sports clubs see that and understand that. And it struck me that the Premier League is a perfect example of this, where you have the best from the world all coming here and the public love it. Well, the same principle has to apply to the science community, it seems to me, at all levels. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce my Norfolk colleague and the former Life Sciences Minister, George Freeman. So George, would you like to come up?
Well, Norman, thank you. It's great to see some familiar faces. No, I'd rather speak like this, can't I?
Well, we're recording it all, George.
Let me stand here.
If you stand there, that's fine.
Can you hear me if I talk like that? Is that recording?
Yes.
It's lovely to see a lot of familiar faces, and to be talking about this subject, which those of you who know me know, to me is the most important subject that we face. And I've tried since ceasing to be the world's first Minister for Life Science. It was a joke that backfired on me terribly. I used to start my speeches by saying, it's great to be here as the world's first Minister for Life Science. In America, they think we have loads of them, and I'm the number one. In fact, I'm the only lonely minister for life science. That joke backfired when I did become the last. And you may be surprised to know, having been one of the loudest, noisiest campaigners against Brexit in the name of science and innovation, that I quickly, my last act as I was wheeled out of government, was to set up the Life Science Brexit Implementation Task Force and begged the life science community, I know you're angry, I know you think this shouldn't have happened, don't fight that battle. Now lead on framing what you need from this new government to deliver for Brexit. And my position on Brexit remains, I think short term it's going to be very difficult, very challenging and economically damaging. Long term, if we get it right, I think we could look back in 15, 20 years and say, boy, we made it into a moment of inspiring, energetic national renewal. We stopped blaming everyone else. We stopped blaming Europe. We got a grip. We faced up to our own domestic problems, which actually, I would argue, underpinned a lot of that vote. And we unleashed a new era of enterprise innovation. And science, for me, sits right at the heart of it. I've tried not to interfere with my inheritor ministers. There are 5 who've taken over the portfolio. But I think things are now pretty urgent. So I was delighted, Norman, to come this morning. I'm going to be really brief and quite controversial, as I was never allowed to be as a minister. I have 3 points. The first is that at the heart of this applies to the whole of Brexit, in my view, by the way, but particularly in this agenda, you need a vision for what it is we're trying to achieve. How can our civil servants work without a vision? How can our negotiators negotiate without a clear vision? And I'll set one out in just a moment. Secondly, I think we need to recognise, in pursuing that vision, that research, development and commercialisation are not the same thing. And I want to argue that we need a bespoke relationship with Europe, which is deep on research. We are allowed to evolve to our own regulatory framework, that's the controversial bit, to allow us to globalise and commercialise our science. And thirdly, I want to say something about how we have to do that and radically change the way we treat science in this country in order to make it work. So here's the vision. What on earth are we going to do post-Brexit as we come out of this incredible European single market, go global and connect, to pay off our debt, pay off our, reach a level of economic growth that's sufficient to get out of the debt trap? We're still, bear in mind, only just over halfway through getting rid of the deficit. I want to argue to you that science sits right at the heart of this. The vision for me should be this. As the world goes through the most extraordinary industrial and agricultural revolutions that we led, by the way, in Norfolk, the seeds of the agricultural revolution 300 years ago, the world wants to go through it in 30 years, not 300. And it wants to get from high carbon dependency into a much more dynamic model of food, medicine, energy, science of life, life for science, and help those economies to develop. This country is a science superpower. We're not a military superpower. We're a soft power, number 1 in the world, and a science superpower. For me, the model is this. Let's use our research platform in Europe. It's the world's leading research community. But take our research and our innovation out globally. Give the City of London something to finance. Become the crucible of the food, the agri, the medtech, the clean tech, the technology that is transforming the sustainable living that the world's emerging markets need. And take it global and use our aid budget. Be more ambitious for the world and go out and strike some aid, trade and development partnerships. If we only have 12 destroyers, let's part one off 5 or 6 places where we have a really deep legacy and help them to accelerate their development programme and use DFID to fund a British moral, diplomatic and security programme that goes out into the world and helps export the technologies that are allowing us now to grow crops in the desert, to target disease, to do African digital health, to shatter all the old expensive paradigms of 20th century British delivery. Healthcare is changing, agriculture is changing, energy is changing. We could connect to those markets and give the city something phenomenal to finance. Isn't it ironic that we're a science superpower and a financing superpower and we're terrible at financing science? This is the moment to grip that with a real strategy to go global. And I saw that when I was trade envoy in the Philippines. I was dispatched to the Philippines, having begged Number 10 that I knew nothing about it, didn't even know the name of the capital. It was only then I was told it was the #1 political assassination capital of the world. And they said, by the way, they're not interested, Minister, in your life science. This is a primary economy, concrete, bridges, roads, dams. Anyone who knows the Philippines will know when you get there, we were doing a big aid programme, typhoon relief. What were the 10 businesses, the 10 families that run the Philippines economy really interested in? Getting away from dependence on China for food, China for energy, getting away from dependence on the great Chinese imperial force. And at the end, we had 3 delegations coming back to Britain to invest in British science, in food, in medicine, in energy. They wanted to come to East Anglia, and they wanted to connect with us better. This stuff is popular, and it's commercial, and it's economic, and it would solve the big challenge that we need a new economic model to drive a much higher rate of growth that is sustainable. Second point, so in order to do that, we have to be embedded in the European research community. We've absolutely got to be Premier League on who we recruit. We absolutely have got to be open door and get the best scientists, as we do now. You go to any laboratory, as I did as minister, you're normally 10, 20, 30% British. It's brilliant. There are people from all across the world, let alone Europe. So that has to be right at the heart of any vision. We want to be active contributors, and I'm pleased the Prime Minister in her various key speeches has made clear that science collaboration is utterly integral, and I intend to hold the government to that. It's key. But I want to argue that on regulation and development, R is not the same as D and is not the same as commercialisation. I led the Fresh Start group of European reformers on development and regulation, and I put it to you that actually Europe is not yet in the right place on the big science and technology that's going to change the world, on genomics, on data. There's an awful lot of captive lobbying by big companies, by anti-science groups. This country should be leading the new regulatory playbook for 21st century science. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us. A country that can't afford to pay top dollar for drugs, can't afford to pay top dollar for innovation in our public services, to say, no, what we will do will be the best place to come and test it. Let's unleash the power of the NHS as a research platform. Companies will, that was my model and mission as minister, come here, not because we pay them a good price, we don't. Our civil servants are very good at negotiating on our behalf. The reason they're going to come is we can give them the data, the insight, the access to the right patients, cut 6 or 7 years out of trials. We'll actually get big discounts on the drugs. But to do that, we've really got to exploit some regulatory freedoms, and that's what the reforms I put in place. The accelerated access reform was all about shortening the regulatory timeline. Europe won't do that for us. Actually, they will hold us up. So there's an opportunity here, really embedded in research, but to take the freedom. So I'm a regulatory diverger, actually, not cliff edge. We need some transition into this. But I want us to grip the opportunity to write the playbook so that companies in 10 years say, I tell you what, when Britain left the EU, I was really worried. But God, they're smart. They've written the book on how you do enlightened, accelerated regulation. People trust us around the world. We're really good at this. Third point, if we're going to commercialise, we've got to move away from the post-war model that we tip money into science academic silos, not enough, and we support an economy that isn't really a science and innovation economy. And we have a city that sells derivatives and futures that it turns out it didn't even understand. We've somehow got to become a science and innovation economy, not an economy that is really good at science but doesn't make much of it. And that is a really bold mission. And Neil, actually, when he was Special Advisor to the former Chancellor, who did a huge amount to support me, there were about 10 of us who really got this. We were just beginning to do some work on how you really plug the city in. And I won't bore you now, I haven't got time, but there are some amazing opportunities coming. The pension reforms in the budget is about to create a huge market for, I'm talking billions of pounds, incentivised to come into UK science companies. If we get this right, we will build the billion-dollar companies here, and we will be able to globalise them. And I think our aid budget is key to it. As Minister, we got nearly £1 billion from the DFID budget to support science, to support vaccines. I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about, Norman. For example, Porton Down, a windy, barbed-wired former nuclear biological chemical warfare research institute. Public Health England moved to Harlow because it's nicer and it's near Cambridge and the coffee's better and it's a cluster. When I went to have a look, as the local MP said, God, what are we going to do now? I found a company called Porton Biopharma. They're brilliant at vaccines engineering and manufacturing. They do contract research. There's almost no management. They make 50 million a year profit, which PHE take to Harlow to spend on coffee. Why don't we turn Porton Biopharma into a biosecurity campus? Why don't we get Gates and WHO and DFID to fund it, link it to the Jenner Institute, and make Porton Down a world-leading institute campus for vaccines, which are going to be one of the most powerful tools in the next phase, and then use our DFID budget to globalise it. I think this is exciting. I think it's inspiring. I think it would give people hope that we've got a vision beyond Brexit. Science is core to it, but I think we need to be quite cute about getting what we want from Europe. And if we don't, I fear we'll end up with a Brexit that depresses the science community, and we'll gradually see less investment, more people going elsewhere, and we will have massively dropped the ball.
Thanks very much. So some interesting and challenging views there from George, and a really helpful contribution. I think the Minister is here, but just before he comes into the room, if any of you want to reflect and comment on what you've heard, let's just spend 3 or 4 minutes literally having some contributions from the floor. Yes, Remember again to say who you are and keep your contributions short, please.
I represent the Association of Medical Royal Colleges. Soaring rhetoric, no, that's too critical, George. That was a good minute or so of uplifting stuff. However, can I just bring you back to reality? I've run clinical trials, and my members run clinical trials across the world. To suggest that we can, as the UK, change the clinical trial approval regulatory system across Europe, I'm sorry, that is unrealistic. This is a very complex bureaucratic administrative system, and we have to stay in regulatory alignment, which I think is what you said, in fact, with the EU, in order that we can continue running clinical trials in the UK. Clinical trials are a collaborative venture across the world, especially, and we need to stay closely aligned to the EU. Otherwise, our researchers are going to get cut out. And I know you have a background in life sciences. You have some experience of the clinical trial process. It is simply unrealistic to expect that we can change the European clinical trial regulatory process. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that. Any other contributions before we move?
I'll take that happily.
So, yes, second row from the back.
Hello, my name's Jo Revell. I'm the Chief Executive at the British Society for Immunology. I'm hugely enthused by the development of the vaccine research networks that we see going on now. A great coup for the UK that we're doing this. I think I'd like to ask how you feel actually about whether we're really explaining not only we want to attract the brightest and the best here, but we are a huge exporter of knowledge. In our field, we have people who've done immunology PhDs working in 59 different countries, many in vaccines, many in global health. What do we do to explain this more? Because I think this is getting lost as a message.
Well, it's a vitally important challenge, and I don't know whether George, I can see the Minister coming in the back. Do you want to comment on that very briefly?
Very briefly, just to take those two. Hi, Sam. Look, clinical trials. I tried to make the point that we don't need a cliff edge now. There is a clinical trials industry, but it's changing fast. Genetics and data are going to transform the clinical trials sector. It'll be unrecognisable in 20 years. So I think to argue that we need continuity of an old system, the whole double-blind, placebo, all that very expensive trial infrastructure is changing. Industry knows it, you know it, I know it, technology is changing it. And my argument is, given that we, in my view, regrettably, are coming out of a situation where we lead the European regulatory framework, the benefit that makes that worthwhile is that we can now lead our own. And I do disagree with you that there's no alternative. There absolutely is. And that's what the Accelerated Access Review about. It's what the conditional approvals is about. Ultimately, we're going to move to a system where instead of having a cancer drug and you trial it on everybody, 15-year trials, $2 billion, 80% failure, we'll work out through genetics and data which patients it works on, get it into them much more quickly. The charities have a key role on the ethics of this. And that is the new paradigm, and it's coming. Now, I'm not saying we should therefore completely rip out of the European system next spring. No, I made the point about transition. But I think we've got to be inspired by leading that. Honestly, if we get it right, I think people will say the Brits were smart. They actually, outside of the European network, still dominated because they actually proved in the NHS how you do it. And on immunology, I think you're absolutely right. We engage in massive knowledge transfer, most of which we don't benefit from. We're giving this stuff away. For me, one of the most inspiring moments was when we tackled the Ebola crisis. GSK, British aid, British troops, British flag, soft power. Amazing. Why didn't we tell that story to more people? That was what Britain can do in the world. But I think it's not just telling the story, it's harnessing it and making it a commercial reality. I think we could have 50,000 people working in immunology and vaccines in the central southeast in that corridor. We need to commercialise as well as tell the story.
Thank you very much. And it's great now that we have Sam Gyimah, Science Minister, with us. I've explained, Sam, that ministers always arrive late. I remember it very well from my time, but it's great that you're here. The reason we're holding this is to give the science community the chance to come together at this quite critical phase as we move into phase 2 of the negotiations, to make sure that the voice of the science community is heard. And it's really important, I think, for the community that they hear from you, you give them an idea of where we're at and what your priorities are. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
thank you, Norman. Thanks for inviting me here today. And thank you, George. Very good to hear you speak at this important summit. I think it is right to bring the science community together at such a critical time for our country, but also for our science, especially because it matters so much to the UK. Obviously, as a fairly recent appointee to the job, I have been making sure that I understand the depth and the breadth of what goes on within the UK science, research and innovation world, and it's incredibly staggering. But also trying to work out what the key priorities are, most of you, what they are and how we chart a course forward. And for this reason, I was in Bulgaria, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, speaking to EU science counterparts about Horizon 2020, our continued participation in that, but also Framework Programme 9. But what struck me as a relatively new appointee is how respected and how valued our contribution is as a country, not just to science, the European project, but also science in general. And it's something that I'd say, looking at this as a member of parliament, but someone coming in from the outside, we need to do more to make the public appreciate, not just that how much we punch above our weight in terms of impact, but the breakthroughs that impact real lives that UK-based scientists are behind. And this is why another visit I did to Imperial, where I met Zeno the robot, was particularly interesting. And this is a robot that could help with autism, was particularly interesting because there you could see scientific breakthrough, innovation, but also how it impacts real life. But it's not just that. I mean, science is key to our future financial success. The challenges we face in the years to come, clean growth, aging population, future of transport, advances in AI and robotics will only be met by concerted research and innovation effort, as I'm sure you're all aware. But these are all global challenges, and so we need to operate in a global marketplace. And that requires investment today if we are going to get ahead of the curve. And we should be ready to provide goods and services that the whole world will want tomorrow. And that's why we have put research and development at the heart of our industrial strategy, committing 2.4% of GDP on research by 2027 is a huge and significant ambition, and initiating that with the biggest increase in public R&D funding for 40 years. I think it's something that we can be proud of as a country. I think meetings like this serve to underline how much, as I've said before, science and technology touches. I've mentioned the example of Zeno, the robot, but also the partnership between British and European researchers. That's no novelty. The UK has long been an international scientific force. If we were to take one specific metric, and many of you will probably be aware of these, but for me it's a source of pride for argument's sake. If you look at Nobel Prizes for chemistry, British researchers and institutions have been involved in a 3-year winning streak. But we've been winning the prize on our own since 1904 and through collaboration since 1929. By country of birth, we have produced 95 Nobel Prize winners, a significant number of which were in the sciences. And that's before we consider those international researchers working within British institutions. It's true that we sit behind the United States on this, but considering their population is nearly 5 times as big as ours, it becomes clear just how good Blighty is at doing scientific research. But we know that research innovation doesn't happen on its own. And unless you're Newton, ideas don't just drop out of the sky. The best ideas arise when the best minds are able to work together, collaborating within a stable, long-term framework. And over the years, an ever-growing number of scientific Nobel Prizes have been awarded to international teams and to ideas which are being developed in multiple countries. Sir William Ramsay's 1904 Nobel Prize, for example, may have been awarded while he was working at UCL, but his doctorate was earned in Germany. So we draw in proportionally more internationally mobile R&D than other large countries, with a total of 17% of UK R&D investment financed from abroad. So it should be no surprise that as time has gone by, the UK has developed some of the closest relationships with our European neighbours, supported by EU research funds. Nor that we have attracted around 20% of grant funding awarded through the European Research Council, such is the quality of our work. Since the start of the Horizon 2020 programme to September 2017, we have attracted more than €2.5 billion in funding for our innovative universities. And under Horizon 2020, we are a top 5 collaboration partner for all EU 27 countries. This has benefited our international partners as much as it has benefited us. For example, nearly half of all collaborations at the University of Barcelona are with UK partners. Moreover, there are benefits that reach beyond Europe and across the world. Under Horizon 2020, UK participants have played a major part in developing a faster test for Ebola. Working with EU academia and industry, we have developed a portable device which can determine whether a person is infected within 75 minutes. That could become a game changer around the world, with quicker diagnosis helping us to contain the virus more effectively, saving lives and resources on a global scale. Other collaborative projects focus on innovative medicines, decarbonizing construction, and gravitational waves. These are big, ambitious projects built on collaboration. We want to see their like for years to come. So the key question that some of you have asked me in private, but I'm sure is on all your minds, is how do we ensure stability and continuity in the short term? I know how much of a concern this is for you. And through my travels and correspondence, I've been hearing from you directly. In particular, I know the concerns around uncertainty, notably around funding streams. The government wants to ensure you wants to give you as much reassurance and clarity as we possibly can in these negotiations. As underlined in December by the joint report published by the EU and UK negotiating teams, UK-based organisations and people will be able to bid for Horizon 2020 funding and lead and participate in consortia in 2019 and 2020. I've been speaking to Commissioner Moedas on some of the detail around this and how we can make sure that when the detail is worked out in terms of being on the committees and influencing the remainder of the Horizon 2020 project, that we are there as well. The joint report states that UK entities' right to participate in EU programs will be unaffected by the UK's withdrawal from the EU. It also outlines that no EU citizen currently in the UK lawfully, including staff and students at our universities, will be asked to leave the country when the UK exits from the EU. This means there will be no change from the current arrangements for over 2.5 years. To provide further reassurance, in addition to agreement of the joint report, our commitment to guarantee the UK's share of Horizon 2020 funding strands, no matter the outcome of negotiations. So all successful Horizon 2020 bids submitted while the UK remains a member state will be able to continue with an uninterrupted flow of funding. And my message to all UK scientists is continue bidding. Do not bid because you feel the current environment is uncertain. We want our scientists to continue bidding into these programs, as well as obviously protecting UK beneficiaries from the impact of EU exit and providing the certainty that those projects need to complete their work. So what will the future look like? Of course, with or without the decision to leave the EU. In 2020, the current EU research programme will come to an end. Horizon 2020 was always a time-limited project, and this continues to be the case. But you want to know what comes next for the UK. I assure you that we are actively engaging from inside the room to make sure that the next generation of programmes build on the success of Horizon 2020. And one of the things that I sought clarity on, certainly during my bilateral meetings at the Informal Competitiveness Council, was that future programs would focus as much on excellence as they have done in the past. And that was given very strong reassurances on that. But furthermore, the Prime Minister and I have been clear that we would welcome an agreement to continue to collaborate with our EU partners on all major science, research and technology initiatives, especially enabling us to tackle the global challenges we face as Europeans, but also as global citizens. And this determination means that we need to focus, as I've said, on excellence. But also our intentions are to be an open international partner. The UK has always been a strong believer in the international nature of research and will continue to encourage the EU and countries around the world to collaborate on global issues. I want the EU to flourish, and I want to see science tackle the big issues we are facing down. But I am the UK's Minister for Science, so naturally, I want the UK to be the go-to place for scientists, inventors, and tech investors from across the globe. That includes the rest of the world as well, not just the EU. I'm very proud that the UK became the first nation to sign a formal science and innovation agreement with the United States in September 2017. We've also signed a similar agreement with Canada and developed a joint science and innovation strategy with China. These agreements provide new opportunities for our universities, institutions, and businesses, so they can take on bold new challenges in some of the most dynamic research environments in the world. Through our science and innovation agreement with the United States, we have invested £65 million in the Long Baseline Neutrino Facility and the Deep Underground Neutrino Experiment. These are extraordinary projects, so much so that people call them mega science. Hardly the most scientific term, but you can't deny it has a ring to it. And no wonder these investigations are aiming to address the big questions about the origins and structure of the universe. Participating in these projects will keep us where we belong, pushing at the outer limits of human understanding, showing the rest of the world what we can do. We have achieved a great deal with our EU colleagues, and I hope we will continue to do so. We are committed to establishing our ambitious science and innovation agreement with the EU so that we can maintain our close relationship. We have made a clear commitment to excellence and innovation, and no country in the world will want to turn their back on that. An official agreement between the UK and EU, I believe, would be a win-win, allowing ongoing collaboration through an established, effective mechanism, provided that we can maintain the shared focus on excellence. And if, as the Prime Minister referred to in her Florence speech, the UK continues to take part in specific policies and programs such as those that promote science, education and culture, any ongoing contribution we agree to make should be proportional and designed to cover our fair share of the costs involved. We need your help to share these ideas internationally with your partners and collaborators who can raise this issue with their national governments. Your actions will support us in securing the best deal for all. We're heading in the right direction, embracing the opportunities and delivering stability and clarity wherever we can. Still, I know you will have other issues you will want to see addressed. They are fixed in our minds as negotiations continue. We will continue to welcome international talent to the UK, and we will do all we can to maintain funding to support innovation across the UK. Our ambitions and our hopes are high. We know you want to keep collaborating, and so do our counterparts. From Sir William Ramsay in 1904 to Richard Henderson in 2017, we have built our scientific reputation on collaboration. Our relationship with the European Union is changing, so now more than ever, it's time, I believe, to speak up for collaboration. That's what I intend to do here in Westminster, throughout Europe and around the world. And certainly, when I met Venki Ramakrishnan, he made very clear to me is what is expected of a science minister in this role, and one that I share. And just as a postscript, obviously this week the government announced the higher education funding review, and I'd like to assure you that I am very focused, and indeed it is in the terms of reference, that sustainability of any funding system, any changes would have to have regard to the sustainability of our universities, but also the commitment that we have made to 2.4% of R&D to deliver on our industrial strategy. So with that in mind, I'm planning to stay for as much of the next session as I can. I know I'll be in front of the committee, I think in 2 weeks' time, or maybe even next week actually, to answer more detailed questions on our plan for the way forward. But thank you for bringing everyone today. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to working with you to ensure that our collaboration continues. But even more than that, the UK becomes genuinely a place to go to for science and innovation post-Brexit.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam, very much indeed. Now, what I suggest is that we're running late, and if you can hold off your desire for caffeine, let's have 10 minutes of contributions. Please keep your contributions tight, stick to the 1-minute rule so that others can have their say. So I'm keen for Sam to hear as much as possible from you here. And perhaps after you've given your contributions, I can just ask Sam to give some final reflections after hearing what you've had to say. So let's have a show of hands. Remember to say who you are and where you're from. Front row first of all, and then middle and back, and then we'll come on to this side.
Naomi Weir from the Campaign for Science and Engineering. Minister, thank you for your comments and for being here today. You did talk about wanting to be a place that continues to welcome international talent to the UK and the intention to be an open international partner, and as you repeated at the end there, the go-to place from across the globe. And obviously we very much welcome those words, and for fear of repeating myself, what we need to do is make sure that we do everything within our power now to make sure that's the case, as well as we go into negotiations. And there's some things that are unilaterally in the government's power to help with this that currently are not being done. One of those is around the Tier 2 cap. At the moment, I know of one organisation that has had 8 engineers rejected 3 months in a row for business critical roles in a research organisation. That's one. There have been thousands of brightest and best rejected by the UK because of an arbitrary cap. We cannot, on one hand, say we want to welcome the brightest and best, and on the other hand, reject them purely to meet an arbitrary cap. We would very much welcome your support within government to try and get that changed, because that messaging, as well as the damage to projects happening now, is not going to be helping us to try and be that place as a go-to place for science in years to come.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Now to the middle.
Morning, I'm Chris MacDonald. I'm the Policy Chair for Innovation for the Federation of Small Businesses, and I also run a not-for-profit research institute. The FSB polled their members recently, and they found that only 20% were positive about engaging in EU innovation, largely because of the difficulties small businesses find in terms of the bureaucracy associated with the schemes. So from a small business perspective, whilst we'd want to see a continuation of working with the EU, we'd also want to see something better and something that worked better for business. And is that a priority in your discussions?
Thank you, Chris. And then at the back, and then we'll come from the back forward on this side.
Robert Massey, Deputy Director of the Royal Astronomical Society. As I'm sure you'll be aware, we represent curiosity-driven research, which is done incredibly well out of European funding sources. So, for example, some of our institutions receive almost 70% of their funding through that sources. So they're worried about a cliff edge beyond 2020. The assurances until that time are welcome. And they're also worried about the impact on people and the messages it sends out that you referred to in your speech. And thank you for coming here to talk to us about this. What are the prospects, realistically, of us remaining not just collaborators but partners in FP9, able to shape the programme and able to lead bids as the Brexit negotiations play out? Because the messages we receive are very conflicted on that. On the one hand, there is this rhetoric about, yes, we want to maintain a deep and enduring collaboration, but at the same time, the proposed immigration controls and the other aspects of withdrawal from the single market and the customs union and everything else make it look as though that's increasingly less likely. And, you know, the feedback we get from this, from our fellows, our members, is really not great. Morale is not brilliant at the moment. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
Thank you. So then a hand up at the back, and then we'll, as I say, we'll move forward seamlessly.
Hello, Felicity Birch from the CBI. Thank you, Minister, for your comments, and was very interested to hear the points you're making about international collaboration beyond the EU. CBI has already been engaging with BEIS on the development of the international R&I strategy, but I just wanted to sort of reflect some comments that we had from our members yesterday around the point that engagement in EU science and innovation programs is often the first step to broader international collaboration, and it's often a lot easier to engage with people who are nearby, even with the development of things like Skype and well, not development of Skype, but even with new technologies that make international collaboration easier. It's a contact sport. It matters being near to people, and I just wondered to what extent those relationships with the EU and the EU framework programs will feature in the international R&I strategy.
Thank you very much, Felicity, and then row in front.
Thank you. Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. Thank you also for your comments. I just wanted to impress the point that was made in the earlier session about we don't have the luxury of time, in that everything you spoke about, what we want to achieve, I'm sure everyone in this room agrees with, but people are not taking up jobs now, people are leaving now, so it's a problem today and something that can't really wait to be sorted to the date of leaving Brexit. And also just to pick up Naomi's point about inconsistency of language, you said the government wants to speak up for collaboration between EU and UK partners, but there is a problem when on the one hand the government says the deal we want to make will prioritise collaboration, but when it comes to decisions that can be made right now today unilaterally by the government, there are question marks about whether the right collaborative signals are being sent out. And I think if we want to be in a place where the community feels like we are going to get the deal we need when it comes to collaboration post-Brexit, we're looking for signals around what the government making the decisions that are in their control today are actually also speaking out for collaboration.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So then, woman in the next row forward.
I'm Kat Ball from the Association of Medical Research Charities, and we represent over 140 medical research charities that fund in the UK. And I just wanted to say that I very much welcomed your points about the impact on people's lives that science and research brings. And I think funding, particularly from medical research charities, really has the patient at the heart of it and really wants to ensure maximum impact for patients. And I just wanted to ask you to remain mindful of those people in negotiations on science and research to ensure that there is no negative impact on those communities.
And then the next row forward, there's three. Oh, there's one person in the same row, sorry. But yeah, you go next.
Gillis O'Brien here. I represent the Association of Medical Royal Colleges, Royal College of Physicians, etc. Just want to address the regulatory aspects of the approval of medicines. There is a great risk from Brexit that the UK will be further behind in the queue if we don't have regulatory alignment for the approval of new medicines, which will lead to patients being disadvantaged because they may either not get those new and innovative medicines or they will get them much later. And that's been seen with, for example, Canada, because when the UK is outside the EU, we'll be a small market for the pharma industry, and therefore applications for approval will come in later because they will prioritise the EMA 26 or 27. So that is an area that I would, I'm not sure it's within your brief, Minister, but I would very much like focus on in the negotiations.
Thank you. Just pass the microphone along the row.
So, again, Alistair Buchan from Oxford, really concerned about mobility of our scientists and our academics. And the funding that they hold makes them mobile. It allows them to come here. It also allows them to leave. And the cliff edge is actually happening now, because if people aren't able to apply and hold money and be here, they will leave whilst they're still mobile and have funding. And if they do get funding, they are, of course, very attractive in the transfer market. So we need to do something right now. We need to ensure that if they apply and get funding, it will be available. And secondly, that they will be welcome. Otherwise, we are at risk of really quite sudden losses of our talent, and I'm concerned.
Alistair, thank you. Pass it along to the end of the row and then to the row behind you and then to Vicky at the front.
David Cole-Hamilton from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Two small points. The first one, we've been told there will be no cap on foreign students. Can you iterate that and make it public, please? And the second one is to do with your comment about international bodies trying to influence the negotiators from the other side. I've recently finished being president of an organisation which coordinates the work of all the chemical societies in Europe. And our body has in fact done exactly that and sent a paper to the negotiators, the European negotiators, indicating very clearly that we are very keen, or the European chemists are very keen to see the UK remain within the European programmes. We would like to see that happen for all other disciplines as well, if that's possible.
I'm Paul Kellum. I'm from the Microbiology Society. I'm also a professor of virology at Imperial College and an industrialist. One of the things we seem to be conflating here is the difference between the EU and the Brexit negotiations and things that we can influence on the global stage. I wonder what the commitment we can have from government now to change, much like other people have been saying, the attractiveness and the immigration status of the UK for international scientists as a bellwether for what our aspirations are in the future.
Thank you very much. And then Vicky, finally. Oh, well, of course, there's more emerging.
So, Norman, when I came on this committee, I absolutely promised that I was never going to just be the token woman and ask only women's questions, and I'm just about to break that promise and ask a very woman question, having just been over in the House asking the Home Secretary, who's now the Women's Minister lead, questions about women. So, it's 100 years of women getting the vote. It's women in engineering, and we've absolutely promised that we want to get more women involved in STEM subjects. And this visa issue is particularly challenging for women in science, because the visa, which works, as I understand it, that requires you to be at work in the UK for serious periods of time, doesn't fit well for scientists who need to move to study and work in other parts of the world. But it's also very difficult, I think, for people who take a career break. So urgently, whilst you're looking at the need to make sure that visas work for our scientists, can you also point out possibly we need to make them specific for the women scientists as well, and bring all these issues together?
Thank you. Now, I want to ensure that others do have the chance. So very brief contributions, starting at the back. Stephen.
Stephen Benn, on behalf of the Royal Society of Biology and a dozen other societies. Thank you for your comments, Minister. My question is, what further information do you hope to be able to provide to Parliament and the Select Committee on the issues that have been raised today by the time Parliament takes its meaningful vote on any deal?
That's very succinct. I'm most impressed. Thank you. Now, there was another, yes, woman in the middle there, absolutely, and then at the front.
Jo Reynolds from the Royal Society of Chemistry. My question was about regulation. We advocate for a future regulatory system for the UK that strikes a good balance between nurturing innovation, protecting the environment and health, and enabling the UK to trade internationally. We've heard some other views on regulation, both in the short term and the long term. So my question is, on day one after exit day and during any agreed transition period, will it be the UK or the European Commission making our regulatory decisions?
Thank you. And then finally, in the front row.
Julia Bucky, I'm representing Universities UK and Vice-Chancellor of Brunel University London. My question is about the fee status of EU students and when we're going to have certainty about what their status will be from 2019 onwards. So both in the transitional phase and afterwards, students wanting to come to university in 2019 are already thinking about it and making decisions, and this is really very urgent.
Thank you. And just from me, Sam, a theme that just keeps getting repeated is the sense that time is of the essence here, and that we need to move beyond sort of high-level aspiration to some clarity about the detail, particularly on the successor to Horizon 2020 and on people. The status of people coming into this country, the messages we send out about our desire to attract good people to this country, but clarity on the detail is now an urgent priority. I think that's reflected from several of the questions that have just been put to you. And the final point I just wanted to make that's been made here and was also made in the presentation of the new Wellcome Royal Society piece of work this morning that you'll be aware of, that we just can't take our preeminence for granted here. That, you know, you spoke about the amazing things that British science has done, but keeping us at the forefront is a massive challenge, and we have to set the right framework to ensure that that happens. So could you respond to what you've heard?
Good. I'll try and respond to as many of those questions as possible, some in sort of more broad and principal terms. My starting position here is, you know, in higher education, the UK is a global superpower, right? Evidenced by the fact that the brightest and the best from around the world are queuing to study here, evidenced by where we are in almost every research ranking that you can create, but also evidence, and this is underpinned by the work that is done in the scientific community. So therefore, politically, our approach should be not to do anything that undermines that global status. And as the chairman of the select committee said, because we cannot take it for granted. So that's my starting position. If I had my way, I would say, given that we know that in terms of the EU negotiations, science is one area where we can arrive at a position that is a win-win between us and the EU. Absolutely. Why don't we do that part of the deal first and everything else? But as you all know, not just this is, on the Commission side, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that causes some understandable frustration in terms of clarity, in terms of detail. But what I can make clear is kind of where our priorities lie and what we want to get out of these negotiations. And on FP9 in particular, the successor program to Horizon 2020, I hope there is no ambiguity about certainly the British desire to continue to participate in it. But also we've got to be clear that we are not going to participate at any price. And the terms will be different from what they are now. Who knows? But I think it's worth just making it clear that it's got to be a realistic deal that works for the UK. A lot of questions around visas and mobility and international students, all legitimate questions, and particularly what we can do now. I'll take that on board and come back to you, probably select you with some more detailed answers. But I agree that for it to work, for our global position to work, mobility of labour is absolutely essential, because otherwise the scientists will move. And if the scientists move, then we are not further forward from where we are now. So I am very much aware of that, and so is the Prime Minister in terms of what we need to do there. You'll be aware of the Migration Advisory Committee is currently looking at evidence of the impact of international students on our higher education system. We'll be submitting evidence to them, and very much my position is this is a good thing. It is not just a good thing for us in terms of science and research, but it's a good thing for higher education overall. But in many of our towns and communities, is actually a really positive thing. So that's kind of where I come at this from. And in terms of the number of international students, there is no count in international students now, as far as I'm aware. But we also have record number of international students studying at our universities, and I would want that to continue to be the case. The question on EU students and the fees, etc., we would be making a decision on that very shortly, is all I can say. But I'm very much alive to that, and I know given when people have to apply by, and some people will not just be looking at UK universities, could be looking at other universities around the world, we need to give certainty on that very, very shortly. And I am alive, very much alive to that point. The question around small businesses, and that for some small businesses, the current EU framework is not as satisfactory for them. I think my answer is, of course, when it comes to science and innovation, our activity is not bounded necessarily by the collaboration with the EU. There is a lot more that is going on. And certainly when it comes to innovation, disruptive technologies, there's a lot more we can do to make sure that smaller businesses doing probably more straightforward things are not forgotten in this, when we articulate these high-level ambitions. And what I'd say is it's not bounded by the EU. There's a lot more, and certainly if we achieve 2.4% to achieve 2.4% of GDP on innovation by 2027, we'll have to go beyond what we're doing with the EU in that respect. And aware of that too. But overall, my takeaway from this is, if we are going to be the go-to place, yes, money is important, but ultimately it's about people, it's about human ingenuity, and it's about facilitating that movement and making sure that we can actually have the best study here. And you have my commitment, and that I understand that, and that is something that I will be fighting for within government, because it is essential to make a success of this. Much focus is on the financial services industry as a beacon for UK commerce. But actually, after that, I think, and not very far behind, is science and research. And what I want to do is make that very clear, certainly within government and publicly, so that in terms of policy response, we make sure that policy does not in any way undercut this as we leave the EU, but actually builds on our success. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'm particularly encouraged to hear that you saying that if you had your way, this is the area where we would regard as a priority, and if we could set the tone for the rest of the negotiations with the EU by achieving a clear and ambitious deal on all these key issues affecting science, then I think everybody would celebrate, because the uncertainty is very damaging here and now. So thank you for that encouragement in terms of your position. Now, before we break for our caffeine fix, 1 minute of thought from George to finish off with.
Thank you, Norman. Two things to say. I thought that selection of questions really told the story loud and clear. What I heard there is that this isn't a community worried about cliff edge next spring. It's happening right now. Because it's not about the laudable commitments that we've made on investment. I'm proud of them. It's not about the commitments, the strategies. It's about people. And the figures, I don't know if you heard, Sam, from Michael Arthur at UCL. It might have been just before you arrived, but basically the applications have dried up. Totally dried up. And my worry is that if we don't send a signal, and I think it is cultural, it's about reassuring people that we're pursuing this in a spirit in which we recognise that access to global talent and talent coming in here is utterly central, not a negotiating point. It's completely central, and I think you're hearing from this community that and the regulatory reassurance that we're not going to suddenly commit harry-kiri and jump out of an aircraft next spring and have no regulatory platform. I think that's happening particularly on talent right now. My second message is I'm worried that because of the complete immersion in negotiation, we're not doing the really big bit of work, which is about the only thing that really excites me about Brexit, which is how we really unleash a science and innovation economy longer term. That's not a criticism of Sam. He's tied up with doing the really short-term work now. I think we've got to recognise we're leaving the European Union as it is, and we've got to make this a moment where we globalise and rewrite the playbook and lead. And Britain is a science superpower, and I don't think I speak as a very noisy Remainer, but this is happening. We've got to make it work for science. And I think if we, yes, lobby on the short-term stuff now, but also come together and think about how we can make this country a global science and innovation powerhouse, we might all be surprised in 10 years what we've managed to achieve. And I'm going to continue to focus on that long-term stuff. But can I just say, you're very lucky to have in Sam a minister who really gets this. There are some ministers who don't get their subject, but we've got somebody here who really does, and I'm so pleased to see you and to be working with you.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Well done, George.
since.
Yeah. Fantastic. We're not so new, obviously, but that's wonderful. Yeah.
So we're getting tenants in these days as well.
Brilliant. That's good. No, but I remember talking to he was talking about the original vision of getting loads of sort of social companies and so on.
It's not quite.
No, we need to make some money.
We do have some good.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coffee collecting. I'm not Norman Lamb. I'm not Steve Metcalf. I'm Vicky Ford. Steve's unwell, and I'm going to take over and chair this third session, which is particularly interesting and I think important because it's on funding and collaboration. We've got an excellent panel. I'm hoping that our panel will be able to talk broadly about the funding issues post-Brexit, but also specifically about elements of funding, because I think it's important as well for the colleagues of mine who are still here that they understand that there is a vast stream of different types of funding that come through European projects, whether it's funding for basic science, frontier science, or funding for much closer to market for industrial partnerships, funding for organisations large and small. And having been in the rooms when Horizon 2020 was negotiating, I remember how incredibly political the discussions about how much money went to each part of those projects were. You know, there would not be the project that there is on agricultural research anything like the size if there hadn't been a Brit in the negotiating room also working with someone from the Netherlands at that time. So just, I'm interested to try and get some feedback from my experts today about not just the general type of funding, but maybe as well as some of the specifics. So with that, I'm going to hand over straight away to our first speaker, who's Ed. And Ed, will you introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Ed Whiting. I'm the Director of Policy. I'll just move that a bit closer. Director of Policy at the Wellcome Trust. I'm going to say just 2 minutes on a report that we've published today called Building a Stronger Future for European Science with a Buzz Lightyear moment to Brexit and beyond, which sets out our views, sort of drawing on a consultation process with the Royal Society and others, but Wellcome's own views on what the future could look like for a UK-EU partnership. We've worked with over 200 organisations and individuals across Europe over 3 months. We've had an evidence synthesis process, a consultation more formally, a seminar at Chicheley Hall chaired by Andrew Whitty, and then some recommendations that we, the Wellcome Trust, have put forward today, all on our website. Please do have a look. Happy to discuss it more length later. I'll just give a brief summary of what we're talking about, a lot of which is about funding, so I hope is relevant to this discussion. Firstly, about Europe's future. Europe produces a third of the world's peer-reviewed science publications with only 7% of the global population. It is a world-leading place to do research. Over the last 10 years, the European Research Council has become the world's most successful multilateral funding scheme and is the gold standard for many sort of scientific researchers, and is a big thing to have on your CV if you are a researcher. Erasmus, similarly, the intergovernmental treaties. If you talk to most European citizens, I imagine you say, what has European science done? One of their first answers may well be CERN. It's done a pretty good job of putting together the mega projects from time to time. I think a bigger job to do on what European funding is doing more broadly to connect with citizens, to make people's lives better. And one point that came through the seminar we had in Chicheley Hall was one respondent saying, look, research is at the heart of how we maintain our standard of living. It is the investment that creates economic growth, and it's the investment that creates high-quality, productive jobs. So I think it's an important sort of part of the broader economic success story, both for Britain and the EU. However, that's not a given for the long term. China's investment in research is growing 3 times as fast as the EU. Other countries, other places, other funders will become a bigger force in research over the next sort of 20 or so years. I think that what we heard was for Europe, there is a challenge that it needs to think about more broadly about how it draws together a broad community from the European Union and outside the European Union to create a European research area that is the go-to place for science. And for us in the Wellcome Trust, we think the UK needs to be a big part of that for the UK's benefit, but also for the EU's benefit and the other countries in it. We think that to do that, you do create an academic hotspot. 6 of the top 20 universities would be in this wider European research area, and those are countries outside the European Union, but part of this collaborative area, so including Swiss and UK universities. We think it's important that over time, not immediately, we can create a bit of momentum to move towards participation on the same basis as member states from those associate countries in science. We think in order for European science to be a strong, values-leading, world-leading place to do science, you need to bring in those associate countries and build and consolidate that block. And we think you need to do that also to maintain the values that Europe has been a leader in demonstrating and in confirming, including the way trials are done, the way data is used, open research, responsible and ethical research practice. And we think actually for the UK, partnering closely with Europe is the best way to secure those values for the long term. It will be much more difficult to secure those values bilaterally, however good our bilateral relationships are. So what does this mean for the deal itself? We think it'd be best for the UK to try and be an associate member of Future Framework Programme 9, and we're very pleased that the Minister agreed with that. We think the funding schemes, which include the European Research Council, that's the biggest deal for a lot of our researchers, but also IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which we're now contributing to as the Wellcome Trust, which we'll talk about in a second, Marie Curie actions, and then specific projects under other schemes. They all have a huge contribution to the sort of vibrancy of European science. But that multilateral funding arrangements, they make collaboration easier. They operate at lower programme administrative cost. It is cheaper to run the European Research Council than it is to run the Newton Fund. We think considerably cheaper. They build global excellence. And importantly for the UK, if we're going to do bilateral deals with other European partners on science, they will need to find new money for that. And if you think that they are putting into European Research Councils and European research funding schemes as an expression of their science funding, that's going to be quite hard to do. Not impossible, but difficult. And we need to be hard-headed about that too. We may well sign some great bilateral deals if we're not part of the European research framework, but I think it's better, it creates a better atmosphere of collaboration and better substantive collaboration if we are. To do that, we need pragmatism on both sides. We need to get over the very difficult sort of hurdles, the sense of you can't do this, you can't do that because of X, Y, and Z. The frameworks for association have been flexible in the past. Israel does not have freedom of movement, and yet it is a full associate member of the European funding schemes. In Britain, we are going to have to work on how we justify the money that goes into the European funding schemes in order to successfully do that. On a back of an envelope, because if that's all you can do, because the British sort of recoveries from European funding schemes are based on the quality of science that we put in, we think that the UK could end up being a small net beneficiary or a small net contributor, depending on how our applications go under Framework Programme 9. We will not do as well as we did under Framework Programme 8 because we don't have a rebate for a start. So we need to be clear about that, and we need to win the argument about why this leads to good science and why it is worth doing for reasons that are not just economic, but additional to that. We also think that, as I say, Europe needs to look at that broader vision. What is the future European research area? How do we move towards one where the associate countries, which, if Britain becomes one, will be up to 10% of the whole of the European research budget, so a much bigger deal than they are now, how they are a big part of how these framework programs work in the future, and how we can build towards that. Separately, we think we need to cooperate on pre-competitive regulation in particular. 2 in 5 of clinical trials in the UK have a site in the EU. The UK runs 25 to 30% of total trials in the EU. And at the minute, there's a huge advantage that you can go through the MHRA as a lead country and get accredited for a clinical trial without having to do 2 or 3 other applications. It would be hugely beneficial if we can retain that. That would require some form of harmonisation with the Clinical Trials Directive. We also think you need free flow of data to make this work. We get 2,500 requests per year for access just to one 1958 UK birth cohort. So data is flowing a lot in a very productive way for patient benefit between the European Union and the UK at the minute. We must find a way for that to continue. In our report, we talk about having an adequacy agreement, the likes of which New Zealand, Israel and Switzerland already have with the European Union, but we think we need to be pretty clear about making that happen. These are not to say that there are not problems with clinical trials in Europe and there are not problems with data regulation in Europe, but we think we need to create that framework in order to move forward and in order to be a constructive voice in the future of Europe too. Finally, on mobility, we know that 22% of ERC grant holders choose the UK to work in. We think that anything less than full freedom of movement would be not as good as what we have at the minute. And we need to be absolutely clear about that. And just before we move on to the next bit of it, let's make sure we get that bit clearly understood and heard. Secondly, we think you should not assume that you just take the arrangements we have outside the EEA and port them over to the EU. It's really hard. We find in the Wellcome Trust, it's often really hard to get researchers, particularly junior researchers, even into conferences from India, from China, from Africa, and we fund a lot of researchers in those areas. We should think about how you can minimize the compromises you need to make on free movement to make migration work in a way that maximizes the flow of talent around Europe. We're not putting a detailed proposal in on that because I think for now we want to say, look, let's just be clear that freedom of movement is at the core of how this has worked. This is talking about 30,000 people. This is not going to break the bank, and we should think about how we can keep that freedom of movement in place as far as is possible, and any compromise from that we need to think about very, very carefully. So as I say, we as Wellcome, we think there is a very bright future as a collaborator in Europe. We think actually there is a final point on funding. There's something about alignment and about will and about the atmosphere of trust you create. The UK has a fantastic R&D system. It has a fantastic translation system. The way that we work with European capital projects from outside the EU, the way we become part of those intergovernmental treaties in the future, are a really big sign and a gesture of participation and intent from the UK. We should think about how we can continue to partner with individual sort of schemes, capital schemes, being a bridge, to making sure these big projects happen in the EU and not somewhere else. And that will take flexibility. But it also comes at a moment where we have alignment of mission and Grand Challenge funding around Europe and between UKRI and what the Commission want to do next. So I think there is a point of alignment which is exciting. Very finally, we as Wellcome take this all pretty seriously. There are 3 things we want to do in future to show our commitment to the partnership. We want to convene more discussions with young leaders around Europe. This conversation, the science establishment in Britain is doing a good job, as is the European. It can be a little bit white, old, male, pale, stale. We'd like to sort of get young leaders more engaged in the conversation. We want to do a review of the regulatory opportunities following Brexit. We think there are some. We think there is actually a lot of competence in the pre-competitive research space that the UK already has. And we should look forward to gene editing, genome sequencing. What can we do around those areas to maximise UK benefit? Finally, we want to work with the European Commission directly on missions. So we're already working with them on AMR. We think we could help to co-fund with the Commission on a whole bunch of other missions. We're intensifying our discussions with them. We think that is actually a future that we should embrace both as Wellcome Trust and as UK. So we've got the report. Would welcome any thoughts on it as we go, but also looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jen Ray, who's the Head of Innovation Policy at Nesta, and I know has been looking particularly at small businesses and innovation.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jen Ray. I'm Head of UK Innovation Policy at Nesta. Nesta is our innovation foundation. We work both in the UK and globally, and we specifically look at research that highlights the role of innovation for growth, for development, and also for benefit to society. So I'm going to use some of that research to talk about today. With my 3 minutes on the implications for funding and collaboration of leaving the EU, I'm going to focus on innovation beyond research, so a slightly wider definition, and specifically the role of innovation in diplomacy and the UK's international relations. And I think this builds on some of the words that we heard from the Minister George Freeman earlier about that vision for the UK post-Brexit. I'm going to highlight some of the activities that Nesta thinks are essential for the UK to invest in, to promote international collaboration that enhances the UK's capacity to innovate itself, but also to benefit from innovation that's happening around the world. So boosting the UK's global standing through investing in our strengths and innovation has become an increasingly important part of our international strategy. But the disruptive effect of leaving the EU and the economic uncertainty that it brings gives a greater urgency and impetus to this work across across the UK. In response, innovation should become central to our international diplomacy as a way of maintaining and strengthening the UK's global position. Innovation diplomacy will involve leveraging our world-leading science base, our outstanding universities and research institutions, and the excellent conditions that we have in the country for innovation to forge partnerships that deliver economic growth and societal benefit. And Nesta had a long-standing piece of spread of work on in this particular area. We've looked at how the UK can collaborate with countries such as China and India, and we've looked at how startups and corporates across Europe are collaborating. And in particular, my colleague Kirsten Bound has written in the past in a chapter in the Global Innovation Index about this concept of innovation diplomacy and how we're reaching an age of innovation diplomacy. And from that, we think that we, the UK, are going to need to invest much more in these types of activities, and we've got 4 of them. One is promoting the attractiveness of the UK as an innovation hub, and that's in terms of talent, and we spoke a little bit about that earlier today, but also of ideas and investment into the UK. Secondly, to develop early-stage international pre-commercial and commercial partnerships between businesses and universities that sow the seeds for future economic growth and competitiveness. 3, to support the framework conditions, and by that it includes intellectual property regimes, migration rules, as we talked about, and some of the trade conditions for regional and global innovation partnerships. And then 4th, encouraging and enabling collaborations and those networks between public, private, non-governmental organisations, and in particular the opportunity to address global grand challenges from health pandemics to climate change. So there's an important role here for the UK's industrial strategy and that domestic policy and the organisations that develop and deliver it. In particular, the newly formed UKRI is going to have to get up to speed really fast on its international role, and we hope that it focuses on the innovation side of it just as much as the research side. And then there's the funding. So there's a already strong foundation on which to build. We have initiatives such as the Newton Fund, the Global Challenges Research Fund, and new strategic partnerships that are being developed with the US and China. They're important opportunities. And certainly, agencies like Innovate UK and the research councils increasingly have the capacity to operate internationally. But the potential of losing the networks that being a member of the EU give us, plus some of the challenges around the distance, makes it hard to build these innovation diplomatic relationships. And the programs that we have are a drop in the ocean compared to what might be required. And we need to build on the lessons that we've learned from those experiences to design and deliver a much more sophisticated and mature approach to collaboration and international innovation. And the UK has traded on this strategic position as a gateway to Europe for many years. We need to maintain the strategic bridge, but we also need to clarify an agenda for engaging with the world on innovation on our own terms.
Thank you very much. Jen, one of the points that we may not have got clear is that sometimes the projects that are funded through the EU are actually operating in other parts of the world. And there's for example, you'll have noticed in the news, there's a political desire to relook at some of how our international development money is being spent. And the projects that are happening that the UK often leads of working, for example, on clinical trials in developing countries that are funded through the EU are really good examples of tie-ups. So people who are interested in that sort of international reach as well, I think need to be making sure that the politicians hear very clearly those opportunities at this time. I know the International Development Secretary is very focused on the benefits of that. Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Arthur, Chair of the Russell Group EU Advisory Group. Mike.
Thank you very much. I'm going to concentrate my comments around the EU Framework Programme and also the European Research Council, but I wanted to sort of set it in an overall context, and that was the context of UK's involvement in addressing grand challenges and solving global problems. So issues like equality and justice, social inequalities, the impact of transformative technologies, global health, human well-being, climate change, sustainable cities, cultural understanding, and the impact of that on terrorism. And to all parliamentarians present, please note the importance of social sciences and arts and humanities in addressing all of those issues, which I personally think the EU has been particularly good at supporting those academic communities. So if we're going to be a player as a nation, if we're going to be a big player in addressing some of those global challenges, then we need to work collectively and collaboratively across universities, across multiple borders. And we've got to work not just with universities, other universities, but industry. We've got to work with governments, we've got to work with ministries, we've got to work with regulators. And the EU framework programme, currently Horizon 2020, and I'm sure this will carry over into Framework 9, is quite simply the most outstanding and the best funding system globally in the world for working in that way. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that even if we tried, we couldn't possibly reproduce it on our own. I've been involved in trying to set up just a trilateral arrangement between the UK, the US and China. It fell flat eventually because, of course, when you go for additional money, the politicians, not surprisingly, say it has to come out of our national research budgets, and the national research systems close ranks because they don't want their funding to be diluted by what they perceive as international intervention. So it's very, very difficult to recreate international funding schemes of the calibre and the importance of the framework programme. So what they do is and what's happened over successive framework programmes is that they've evolved into a highly effective environment in which a large, diverse population of researchers can form new collaborations under an agreed administrative protocol and access funding to support collaborative projects that span those national borders. And as our Chair has already pointed out, that isn't just national borders within the EU. It's now entirely possible to use that money to work pretty much globally. And there are many examples of exactly that happening. So the second point I wanted to make was around the European Research Council, which to the UK has become an absolutely critical part of the funding landscape. And just to give you some numbers, I received an email yesterday from my European office indicating that we were approaching our 200th European Research Fellow successful application since Horizon 2020 started, which was 2014. I mean, it's an absolutely staggering performance. 80% of people who are coming to UCL under that programme are from other European countries. And of course, as they come, they bring their entire research network with them. So they automatically slot into an environment that is good for the UK, because the rest of the researchers at UCL gain access to their personal networks. And as you know, those awards run at 3 different levels. They run at starter level, intermediate level, and senior professorial level. So they're critically important in that greater ecosystem of research innovation that Europe provides. Could we reproduce the European Research Council with a UK-based scheme? Well, we could, of course, set up a scheme, but I'd like to suggest to you that the ERC has stolen the march. They're well ahead of us. They are the #1 prestige scheme that UK and European citizens wish to apply to and to have on their CV, as a previous speaker has already said. So, of course, we could set up a scheme. Of course, we could fund it to roughly the same tune as our funding into the ERC, but I think it would take quite a long time for it to gain the prestige that the ERC has, and it would, of course, immediately be in competition with the ERC scheme. So would we expect people to apply to both schemes, or would they choose one above the other? So you know, I can't see it quite working in exactly the same way. So, of course, I was really pleased to hear what Ed had to say. I completely agree with that approach. I think what we need to recognise is if we do pull out of Europe without a deal, we are losing a great amount of momentum for the future, and in particular in the UK's position in addressing those big global problems. Thank you.
Thank you. So to summarise, the Framework Programme is the best programme for funding science in the world.
Across multiple borders. Across
borders. It's incredibly difficult to recreate. The ERC is particularly helpful for those top-end scientists. And why would we want to try and recreate another one? And if we pull out without a deal, then we would put a handbrake on British science, and especially on addressing those global challenges as well. Thank you. Our next speaker is Geoffrey Maitland from the Royal Academy of Engineering. It's the Year of Engineers and the Institute for Chemical Engineering, and I know Professor Geoffrey Maitland is going to talk a bit about the interface with industry as well. Thank you. We're going to stop at 5:02 on this session, but I'm going to let the speakers keep talking.
Indeed. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I was involved through my role with the Royal Academy of Engineering in this document that was produced at the end of 2016, which was a collaboration across all the 38 professional engineering institutions called Engineering of Future Outside the EU. And that addresses some of the issues I'm going to talk about this morning. I just want to focus on 2 points in my 3 minutes. First of all, that continuing close collaboration with the EU along the entire research and innovation pipeline is absolutely crucial. We've heard a lot about research and how important it is getting the ideas that go into the pipeline, but it also helps take things all the way through, as I hope I'll show you. So the engineering profession believes that seeking the closest achievable association, however we do it, with the future EU funding streams will bring huge benefits to research and particularly engineering innovation in the UK, as it has done in the past. It's not only about the funding, of course, as we've heard, it's all about the access to people, knowledge, ideas, and facilities, all of which facilitate that innovation process of taking research ideas into commercial practice. Now, my colleagues have spoken about the needs of universities and academic research. I just want to focus for a few moments on the needs of UK businesses that need, use, and exploit innovation. And for them, participation in EU R&I programs has been absolutely crucial. And I just want to give you a couple of statistics that illustrate that. Businesses currently account for about 27% of UK's participants in Horizon 2020. So that's a significant amount. And in the 7th Framework Programme, the UK was the 3rd most successful country behind France and Germany by both the finance to businesses, about €1.25 billion, and the number of companies participating, about 5,000. Now, UK's SMEs are particularly thirsty and successful for EU R&I funding, despite what we've heard about the bureaucracy and the difficulty of that for small organisations. They still do it. And also included in that, I want to, as well as the framework programme, I want to include the European Research and Development Fund and also the European Investment Bank. For the ERDF, SMEs are a priority area. And the companies say that they do this because they gain access to funding that's not available nationally or regionally in the UK. And that's to help them grow to the stage when they require equity investment. So this is crucial to their growth and sustainability. So it's therefore essential to ensure that there's continuity in this type of funding, or if we can't do that, then the UK has to create new funding schemes to support this type of regional development. And I think there's some broad issues about replacing regional funding that was crucial from the EU that we need to look at as either Plan A or Plan B. So, I'm talking about SMEs. At the other end of the spectrum and scale, we have European programs that fund large international projects. And these facilitate collaboration between multiple businesses, increasing the ease with which companies who are industrial competitors, that they can collaborate together and work towards common goals. I think BT said that today's collaborative, pretty competitive research is tomorrow's competitive advantage. And a good example of this is one of these joint technology initiatives, as they're called, is the ongoing 10-year Clean Sky programme that's developing smart, green and integrated air transport. And Rolls-Royce is a partner in that, and GKN, but also lots of small SMEs. And while some of the big companies might have alternative sources of funding, the SMEs would find it very difficult in the supply chain to get that alternative funding. So these are projects with budgets and risk, and that's important, which are too large for one country to embark on alone. And it's essential that the UK retains access to these large-scale, cross-border initiatives in industries that have these very internationalised supply chains. And they, of course, bring their own, the big companies bring their own other international partners as well. So there's potential to build on this, to actually bring the partners from both within the EU and outside the EU together, we've heard something about before. I just wanted to stress that urgency, as we've heard, is absolutely critical to these for continuity and planning, and because nurturing partners is a long-term and continuous process, and you can destroy these partnerships fairly quickly, but it takes a long time, and you want to, the certainty about the future is important to bring those together. So briefly, Chair, to my second point, which is that collaboration and funding are intrinsically linked to people and regulation. And I think we've heard that you can't put nice boxes around these things. Everything is closely interlinked. So it's important to recognise that many of the benefits from funding are not intrinsically financial, but they arise, as we've heard, from the availability, the easy exchange and the movement of smart people. And then concerning regulation, it should be recognised that current EU regulatory regimes, such as REACH in the chemicals area, which is my particular area, are inherently collaborative activities. And that changing regulatory regimes post-Brexit could have as much impact on collaboration and funding as on trade. I think we need to build that into the equation. And I'm tempted to say that the analogies with similar concerns about continuing collaboration on security should not be lost on us. So whatever the partnerships that are forged, I think they should provide stability and certainty for all the partners involved, particularly here in the UK. And I think that sums up and underpins most of what I've said and most of what the other people have said. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. I tend to refer to it as the 3 S's, that we want to have collaboration on science, security and students. And particularly because I know the Prime Minister is very focused on collaboration in security. So if I can say it's 3 S's, it's security, science and students, you bring it all together and they draw the parallels. It's very useful. We've got 5 minutes of questions. Starting over here and coming this way, from left to right. Okay, thank you.
Paul Kellam from the Microbiology Society. Picking up on your 3 S's, it's very obvious when you look at the UK National Risk Registry that some of the risks, antimicrobial resistance, emerging infectious diseases, yes, are underpinned by collaboration, science, and future science innovations to combat those. Can we comment, could the panel comment on how we bridge the gap between science and security to bring that message home in future negotiations?
Next.
Johan Schott, representing the Association for Studies in Innovation and Technology and the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. My intervention is this. We can discuss framework conditions for collaborating, and we have been discussing these. But there's another important point that's about the content, the substance, the agenda. It has been addressed, but I think we should address it more, because the world is in a deep transition, and some of our systems are really breaking down, not working anymore, like the healthcare system. So to address some of the global challenges in the UK, we need to think about how we can shape our science system in such a way that we can address these challenges. And the EU is doing this. So we should really think more about this. And then two crucial components are bridging social science, humanities, and the sciences. And that's missing currently. And secondly, not just we need to move from R&D to innovation, but also to social innovation, because the social side will be crucial for making science and engineering effective.
Yeah, keep going across. Hands up. Thank you.
So, Alistair Buchan, can I just suggest that we've got very little time? We need now, we all agree, we're all saying the same things. We need a strategy, one with intent. And we need to crystallize the issue. And I would say that, and Michael and I went backwards and forwards to Brussels, very disturbed that we weren't part of phase one. The funding is the money, and that has to be committed. The citizenship is the attractiveness to get people to come here, and that was the second phase one issue. The third phase was, of course, the Irish Northern Ireland border. We need a strategy. We need one with intent. We need to make sure that we become an Irish Northern Ireland border problem. We need to explain that the infrastructure, the networking, going backwards and forwards across Europe is exactly the same as how Ireland has worked since the Good Friday Accord. We need the research collaboration in Europe to be crystallized as a need for government to address the same way that the border is addressed, with a tight deadline, Good Friday.
Thank you. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. On the positive side on that, I know that my former colleagues in the European Parliament have identified this as an area that they want to prioritise for cooperation. So rather like, those three issues that were identified for phase one weren't just identified by Britain for phase one, they were identified by the EU negotiators as well. So both sides of the table want to solve this. Keep going here.
Good morning.
We've got 1 minute left.
Chris Darby from the John Innes Centre. We're separating funding from regulation this morning, but of course FP9 will be a regulation. And perhaps a question for the Chair, are there things that we should be doing while we still have members of the European Parliament and still have a seat around the Council table before Brexit happens? Thank you.
Yes. Make sure you use them. I'll be there next week. Keep going.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Rob Massey from the Royal Astronomical Society. I was heartened to hear Michael Arthur's comments about how good the existing European funding systems have been, and people accessing them here find them no more bureaucratic than the Research Council's funding stream, for example. My question is, if we do pull out of this, and I think that would be regrettable, one thing to hold on to is that this is a bottom-up system, that groups come together irrespective of political imperatives from above and apply for the funding themselves. I think that's been a huge strength. And whatever we devise in its place, and I don't want us to pull out of this, but any system that replaces it needs to have that in mind.
Okay, that's helpful. Can I do two more to just get them on the record? We won't answer them. They'll get on the Hansard record of the day. Last one, here. And then we hand to Carol.
Ian Chapman, UK Atomic Energy Authority. Last month, the Royal Society published this report, which I'll hold up, about infrastructure in the country, science and innovation infrastructure, and we've not really talked about infrastructure and facilities today. On the front cover of it is a European facility, which happens to be on UK soil, and it is the best facility in the world in its field, both a literal big magnet and a metaphorical big magnet, bringing the entire world here to the UK to do science here in the UK. I'd like to know what the panel think about our role and our interaction with, in the next framework programme, having big infrastructure, European infrastructure in the UK, or our interaction with S3 in the future, and how that might work.
I can give you my personal view, which is I think that large-scale infrastructure is incredibly valuable to the UK as well as Europe, and it would be incredibly disruptive to try and sort of rip it out. And I'm sure everybody agrees. And I think it's been quite helpful that it hasn't been all over the front pages of the newspaper as an issue. Okay. I'm going to hand over to Carol and her panel. Thank you very, very much.
Born like a baby.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are now apparently running extremely late. We have a deadline of 12:30 when we will be kicked out of this room. So we're not running quite as late, however, as I was this morning. So apologies for missing the first section this morning. My name's Carol Monaghan. I sit in the Science and Technology Select Committee, and I'll be chairing the next session. I don't really want to waste very much time because we are so tight now, and we do want to give some time for questions at the end. I've got my phone here, so I will have you on timer, panellists, because I don't think some of the others were quite keeping to 3 minutes. So you now have on the phone 3 minutes, so I'll be waving it in your face. But I think we will fire off with Professor Anne Dell, who is the Treasurer of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and she will kick off this session on regulation. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much. I can be very quick. I will be less than the 3 minutes because the topics that I was asked to cover by the Academy of Medical Sciences and the Biochemical Society have both actually been aired quite vociferously in earlier sessions. So I'm planning to speak a little bit about regulation of drugs, very briefly, just to make just one key point, and then a little bit more on clinical trials regulation. But I am very sensitive to the fact that I have to say that my background is in basic science, not in medical science. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Academy, but I will hand it to the audience if there are any questions that require the expertise as opposed to the prior briefing. So with respect to regulation of drugs, I do just want to draw attention to everything that's been said to date, that with respect to collaborations and interdependence, that applies to research, it applies to innovation, and of course it applies perhaps even more acutely to regulation. So the one point I want to make about the regulation of drugs is with respect to how the UK currently engages with the European Medicines Agency and the EMA. And the UK Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, engages very, very strongly and, in fact, has a disproportionate role in essentially sort of formulating and taking forward the regulations of the EMA. UK farmers' preferred option is to remain in the EMA. The government's position is that the UK will, quote, look to continue to work closely with the EMA. But the nature of this relationship is unclear because working closely with the EMA is not the same as being in it. Being in it means that it remains subject to the European Court of Justice. So the request, as it were, from the Academy and from the Biochemical Society is clarity. What does the government intend to do in working closely with the EMA? What does it actually mean? With respect to clinical trials regulations, if I could put just a little bit of flesh on some of the previous discussion on that for those who are not familiar with the clinical trials regulations and where we are. So a new EU clinical trials regulation, the CTR as it's being called, was originally due to be applied from October 2018, but has been delayed until the second half of 2019. This has moved the CTR outside the scope of the withdrawal bill. So the UK played a major role in drawing up the new regulation, and it's widely considered to be a great improvement on the existing directive. So the CTR is expected to streamline processes for multi-country trials, provide greater harmonization, and very importantly, introduce a digital portal for EU clinical trials. So there's a lot of argument in here that I could have aired on why harmonize, but the actions required, but I think that's fairly obvious from the previous discussion. So I think I'd just like to sum up to say that what we would like from the perspective of ensuring that the regulations are going to allow a pharma to license its drugs, for the National Health Service to continue to work effectively in the UK, and in particular for clinical trials, which really cannot, in my opinion, based on the evidence that I've been given, be focused in the UK. And I just want to make one point on that, and that is personalised medicine. Personalised medicine is only going to be successful if clinical trials can be carried out on a sufficient population of people that are associated with a personalised medicine, and that almost certainly is going to require international clinical trials. And I'm sure there's members of the audience will have many other reasons for why clinical trials will not necessarily work very well focused in the UK. So in summary, we urge clarity on how the government plans to work with the European Medicines Agency and how it plans to prioritise harmonising with the EU clinical trials regulation, obviously when they're implemented, but also, very, very importantly, obtaining access to the EU clinical trials portal. Thank you.
That was over 3 minutes, but
it was.
It was, yes. But I didn't let it buzz. So, but thank you very much, and lots of points packed into that 3 and a bit minutes. So, and maybe some will come back to in the discussion. And if we could now move to Professor Richard Brooke, who is the President of the Association for Innovation, Research and Technology Organisations. Professor Brooke.
Thank you. ETO brings together public sector research establishments, independent research and technology organisations, catapult centres, and a number of private research and technology organisations in this area. The members between them employ over 50,000 scientists, engineers and technicians in more than 60 organisations. I'm going to focus on exporting the outcomes of the UK's research and innovation prowess to the EU after Brexit in the form of new products. At the moment, there's a system of some 1,800 notified bodies across the EU to certify that new products introduced into the EU comply with the requisite directives and standards. This is particularly focused in many instances on hazards to safety. So we're talking about gas appliances, electrical equipment, machinery, chemicals, and anything which has the potential to do you harm. 180 of these notified bodies are presently in the UK. That means you can get your CE mark anywhere in the UK from an appropriate body, and it will be recognised everywhere in the EU throughout the life of that product. This stops for the UK on Brexit. The EU has confirmed that our notified bodies will no longer be recognised in Europe as we leave the EU. This means that without an alternative in place, exporters will have to send their products to a member state to receive CE marking, adding considerable extra cost and delay to the process of new product introduction. It also means that the UK notified bodies will lose a considerable chunk of their business. And we are already seeing UK notified bodies setting up within the EU and moving the work and jobs out of the UK into other EU member states. There's a time pressure here because it's important to get products into the certification queue early on to avoid delay to the date when you want to introduce them. That can take up to 9 months. That means, working backwards, we need certainty about what the replacement regime will be by midsummer of this year. we will need mutual recognition agreements to replace the current system, and they are going to take time and energy to negotiate. It's important that we get on with it quickly. I would also say there's a problem on the import side. If you think about food, the EU does an enormous amount of testing of the food we eat before it reaches the UK. We do some testing where the first point of entry is the UK, but a lot of it is already done by the EU for us. After Brexit, if we have to replicate all of that testing of all the food we eat, it is going to require capacity which we just do not have at the present time and will become an enormous problem. So we have to make sure that our accredited labs and certification bodies retain mutual recognition.
Oops, stop, sorry.
Make sure they retain the ability to assess European new approach directives for CE marking, maintain common approaches with the EU wherever possible to make advantage of the shared resource and expertise, and that we mitigate the impacts by enhancing our presence on global standard-setting bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and apologies for that. I would have stopped it. I was actually just writing something down about what you were saying. Can I maybe just ask you quickly,
yes?
How is this going to impact, for example, food exporters?
I have the answer somewhere delved in my papers here. The point I was picking up on was import, which I think is the more significant problem for us in some respects. But we have to recognise that whatever you're exporting has to comply with EU requirements, and therefore food exporters will have to comply with whatever the EU decides the appropriate standards and tests are going to be. So we will have to keep up and still be able to make sure that we can supply products that comply with whatever direction the EU takes in terms of food safety and standards.
Okay, I think obviously there's a lot of food for thought within that. That's not bad for a Thursday morning, but okay. Moving on next, and thank you for keeping within the time. Moving on now to Kevin Bond, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of Innovate UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So Innovate UK funds and connects business-led innovation in order to accelerate UK economic growth through pioneering the global industries of the future. Whether you're shaping that future as part of the UK's research community, innovation community, or business community, your organisation is going to be working increasingly in a global way. Many of the current EU frameworks have ensured that our highly successful frontier economy has benefited from world-class collaborations in each of these three dimensions. And as we heard from the Minister, the UK government has made it clear that it's seeking a future where the UK can continue to collaborate with European partners on major science, research and technology initiatives. The good news is that we know that these proposals have found a resonance with our collaborators in Europe. The EU High-Level Group on Research and Innovation has noted that full and continued engagement with the UK remains an obvious win-win. The CBI submission to this inquiry, and from Felicity earlier, we've noted that there's a broad consensus among EU businesses that the UK should continue to participate in future framework programmes. So there is a great deal of opportunity in front of us. This week, David Davis also spoke of Britain's determination to lead a race to the top and to the role of effective and supportive regulation. And if we want to turn future opportunities into successful industries, we need that environment. Now, there are many important examples of key areas where our current partnerships with Europe are empowering UK business growth, and let's just touch on some of them. The chemical specialists in the room will be well aware of the REACH regulations that govern chemical use. These impact not just those businesses that manufacture chemicals, but all businesses that need to import or trade in chemicals. The UK is second only to Germany in the number of businesses that are registered to operate under these regulations. So REACH is one of those high standard regulations that is leading in the world in regard to chemicals, and the UK's participants want to stay involved actively because it's their route to staying competitive globally. There are many other sectors which have also indicated a clear need to stay actively engaged with the future evolution of these regulations in Europe, whether that is the creative industries in relation to the single digital market and intellectual property, the aerospace industry in relation to European aviation safety. And we have heard just now from Professor Dell on the importance to health and life sciences. There's also no doubt that there are new opportunities to be seized, and we heard from the Minister how we have now got agreements in place on science and technology with the US, that we've added an agreement to Canada, and we've established a joint strategy to boost our existing partnership in science and innovation with China. And this year we will take over the chairmanship of Eureka, possibly the only other intergovernmental body focused on multilateral international collaborations that can assist us in global research and innovation. All of our dimensions to this puzzle, research, innovation and business, all require effective and international collaborations to keep them on the leading edge. And as activities in research and innovation are pre-competitive, they happen in advance of trade, we have a really valuable opportunity to progress our global partnerships in research and innovation in a complementary manner to the ongoing discussions we're having to securing the best answer in Europe. And we should seize that opportunity and take full advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And finally, and I think we're doing okay-ish for time. Yes, I'm getting the nod at the back, so well done everyone for keeping to time. Finally, can I introduce Professor Graham Reid, who is the Chair of Science and Research Policy at UCL.
Thank you, Carol. I'd like to talk about the role of scientific advice in making and reforming regulations, and to explore some of the preparations that the government and the science community could make right now to anticipate some of the responsibilities that will come to the UK during the Brexit process. There are, broadly speaking, two areas in which we can see new responsibilities arrive on UK desks. First of all, the European Withdrawal Bill and associated legislation currently in Parliament will bring the transfer of thousands of regulatory functions and their enforcement into the UK from Brussels. Now, agriculture, food and medicines have quite rightly had high profile in this meeting and in other discussions about EU regulation, but that's only the tip of an iceberg. The House of Commons Library published a really wonderful briefing about the policy implications of Brexit, where they identify air quality, energy policy, transport, immigration, criminal justice and broadcasting as just part of a long, long list of regulatory functions with a scientific and technological dimension that will shift to the UK in relatively short order. So that's one bit of the picture. But another bit of the picture comes from the international trade and investment deals that the government gives so much emphasis to. Now, if you look at the EU briefing on the work they're doing on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, you get some glimpse of the depth of scientific expertise that's needed to negotiate trade and investment. Once again, it's not just the usual suspects. Everything from trade in suntan lotion to oysters has got a scientific dimension in the negotiations. So we should anticipate a really quite sizable body of work there as well. Now, chief scientific advisors are used to advising on domestic policy over a long period of time. And in some government departments, that form of advice has become really quite sophisticated and highly developed. Less so, perhaps, in other departments. But I do question whether or not the scientific advisory mechanism is prepared for the challenge of contributing scientific advice on the scale and diversity that's going to be required as we leave the EU. We can look to departments like Health and DEFRA as models of high development, and I do hope that newer departments like International Trade and the Department for Exiting the EU will aspire to that sort of sophistication in their scientific advice before all the work lands on their desks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham, and that was, again, almost to time. We have about 10 minutes, is that correct, for questions. We may not get all questions answered. I think, like the last panel, we'll take them in bundles. We've heard from a couple of you there about the risk of diversions of our regulations post-withdrawal, but I wonder if any of you can see any opportunities from our regulations being different or distinct post-withdrawal.
One potential opportunity is with respect to clinical trials on children. That has been drawn to my attention, that if the UK actually was prepared to have a better regulatory environment for the biotech and drug companies developing new drugs, to make it easier and perhaps cheaper for trials to be carried out on children, because very often when the new drugs come in, the regulation is essentially targeting adults rather than children, so children don't get access.
Okay, thank you. And I think Graham wants to come in as well. Kevin, I'll come to you.
I just wanted a sort of, let's get carried away about this. A lot of international trade is based on regulatory harmonisation, and although we're leaving the EU, we're not going to stop trading with the EU. And our regulatory harmonisation isn't just with the EU, it's with the US and with all the other major trading partners. So let's not get too ambitious. On the other hand, there is one area of regulation in which we could present ourselves with a really pretty easy win on economic competitive advantage, and that's by sorting out the immigration regulations.
Thank you.
So, Chair, perhaps I could just bring a couple of these strands together on this one, because at Innovate UK, we often see innovation come in two forms. There's a very disruptive push that has to create an entirely new ecosystem, and the world is not ready for it yet. And then there's established markets that need to change and transform themselves. And I think this is where we see the divergence views in the room. We have established markets that are constantly evolving, that are actually the large majority of the economy. These people need continuity and confidence to proceed and to be actively involved. They will still be innovating, but it will be done with known customers in a known direction of travel. Where we've got radical change, and this is, I think, where George Freeman was also discussing, then there is an opportunity to do something outstanding and new, and that's where the UK can lead. So I think it's not an either-or, it's understanding how to run both of those together at once.
Thank you, Kevin, and then to Richard, and then I'll open to the floor.
Yes, I think if we can get through the short-term glitches and problems that I was alluding to, then I think there are real opportunities, provided that we can invest in the added capacity we will need to deal with multiple territories, all of whom have different requirements, for example, for our exports. But it does mean that we're going to have to invest in a broader range of test facilities in the UK, and somebody earlier on mentioned the UK being the best place to come and get your testing done. That's a great, I think, vision, but we will need to invest to make sure that we put the capacity in. But we've got to make sure we can get through the short term without too much damage to the existing system.
Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, I think probably we're not going to get answers to questions, but again, if you want to make a point rather than pose a question, that's probably, or pose a question and leave it open. So if we start, we'll just move across the room, and we should get everyone. So the lady there, thanks, Martin.
Thank you. I'm Laura Closter from the Bioindustry Association, so one of the trade associations for biotech and pharmaceutical industry. I just wanted to make a couple of really quick comments. In terms of regulation, there's standards and there's process, and standards are international, and we can't move away from those international standards. So we might be able to innovate around process and how we do regulation, but we can do that anyway already, but we can't move away from those standards, or those products won't be international. In terms of regulation and what the industry's been seeking, we've been working very closely with the ABPI as well. We'd like regulatory alignment, which is around cooperating. This means that medicines will continue to be launched in the UK post-Brexit. It means that companies aren't duplicating the same pieces of regulation, so we won't be increasing our regulatory burden. And it also means that the public health systems that we use will be the best that they can be.
Okay, Thank you. If I could maybe ask you to keep your comments short and snappy if possible. So moving on then, gentlemen.
I thought Professor Dell's summary of the clinical trials and the regulatory environment was very good. Could I just point out, there is a historic, quite recent structure for mutual recognition of medicinal products. It was called the Mutual Recognition Procedure in the EU before the EMA was created. So it'd be quite easy, although it seems a bit regressive going backwards, it'd be quite easy to just readopt that system for the UK. And indeed, I would make a further suggestion, why not do it for clinical trials as well? Try and mimic that system, replicate that approach for clinical trials so we don't lose clinical trial participation with consequent effects on patients.
Thank you. I think we maybe go to this side and gentleman at the front. Or sorry, there's lots of hands, so if we can speak quickly, pass the microphone quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, just two quick points. Let's talk about the UK being a leader in some of these regulatory things. We talked about that for R&I, but if we take health and safety, for instance, the UK has been a real leader where the safety case process has been adopted first by the EU and now by other countries across the world. So I think we should identify where we can bring things to the table there that in the negotiations that show that everybody loses if we actually separate. And the other point I'd make is that we haven't talked about regulation of people in engineering. It's particularly important, professional qualifications, and we're members of the Professional Qualification Directorate now. If we cease to be a member of that, that's going to cause all sorts of problems with the recognition of UK engineering qualifications and other qualifications.
Thank you. Gentleman up at the back there. Norman.
Thank you. Mark Downs from the Royal Society of Biology. Just a quick comment really for the Select Committee to consider when discussing these issues of regulation with government. I think a lot of the time there's an assumption that either new regulations can be put in place or we just copy European legislation. But actually there are many examples where that simply won't work because it doesn't exist. So for example, if in the EU you're allowed to export, in inverted commas, within the European Union because you're part of the European Union, you don't have to have domestic legislation in place in some areas, particularly the seed production area, for example, some food areas. When we leave the European Union, we'll be in a position of not having the regulations in place that other third countries already have. Until we have them in place, the exports will have to cease. So the urgency is absolutely critical that needs to take place.
Yep.
Okay. Can I ask, are there people who haven't contributed at all yet today that would maybe like to contribute? There's a gentleman there.
Ian Hanks, UK Deans of Science. So many questions, and I'd love to have had 10 minutes with the Science Minister. Just to connect, and connected with what the comment has just been made, connect the people session we had with this one. The European recognition of qualifications is something that we really do need to come to terms with. I just wonder what is happening, what we should be doing, and I think we need to encourage universities to go through and look back at what they're doing about the European credit transfer system, which if you ever look at a university website, is very far down the list of things that they talk about. But it's absolutely critical at this time when we're trying to persuade Europe that we still want to be with them.
Okay. Thank you. And I think the lady next to you was looking for a question as well. And then I think we may have to call a halt after that because Norman's giving me looks. So.
So I think one of the really important areas of collaboration that we currently have is working with the EU on some of the technical committees that underpin a lot of the regulations that we talk about. Sharing that evidence and data is a really important process. How can we ensure that we don't lose that right from day one of exit?
Okay. Okay, I'm going to unfortunately have to stop here. I know most of the points that have been made, really we could spend hours just discussing each of them individually, but I thank you for your points. You may, on the way out, as they're throwing us out, be able to grab people and have a chat with them, and hopefully we manage to do that. But I'm going to pass over now to the Chair of the Science and Technology Committee, Norman Lamb. Thank you. You guys just stay there.
Do we want to move?
Yeah. Oh, he's going to speak there,
all right.
That's fine.
Before I just give some very final closing remarks, I know that Vicky wanted to make one final contribution, so
two points that came up there. One was, will we stay in sort of standard setting bodies? My understanding of the report that came out overnight last night about transition would allow British people to stay in those bodies, at least in transition. So do make sure that we as a committee are aware of key sectors so that we can say which are most important for science. And ditto on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. There is a mutual recognition of professional qualifications chapter in the CETA free trade agreement. So it's sort of there, but it's not very clear exactly which sectors would be prioritised. So if there are key sectors, like engineering, you've mentioned, that we as a committee may want to highlight their importance to science, it would be helpful, I think, for us to know which the sectors are that you think are important.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. So can I end, first of all, by again thanking Robert and the Institution for Civil Engineers for hosting this. It's been very much appreciated. Thank you. I hope all of you have found it useful. I was very keen that the committee should be facilitating this sort of discussion, particularly at this critical stage. And I think the message that has come through to me very clearly is that this should not be controversial. There aren't people out there on the streets with placards demanding an end to scientific collaboration, for goodness sake. So let's keep the pressure up for an early agreement on the critical issues that affect science, primarily people, which is of such importance, to ensure that we maintain our preeminence. And that point about us not taking that for granted, I think, is incredibly important. An early agreement on participation in the successor to Horizon 2020 is incredibly important to provide certainty for people planning research projects here and now, not in a year or two's time, here and now. So we will take what we've heard today. If any of you have contributions that you want to make on the back of what you've heard today and submit it as written evidence to our committee, you can still do so. So please take that opportunity. Just go to our website and submit it online. We will have the session with the Minister in a fortnight. We will put all of the key points from today to the Minister in a fortnight's time. We will then produce a formal written report which will be submitted to government and be public so that we can get across the critical priorities of the science community. So I've really valued this discussion this morning. I've learnt a lot. I think actually we as a committee should do this sort of thing more often. I don't know whether you agree with it, but bringing together parliamentarians and the science community I just think is of enormous importance. So thank you all. We've had amazing, brilliantly informed contributions from all the panellists, but also the contributions from the floor have been of the highest standard. So thank you all very much indeed. I never thought I would find myself serving coffee at the interval, but you've got to multitask in this job. Thank you all very much indeed for being here. Thank you.